The scientific revolution starts now.
The broadcast.
Let us see in the dark.
We came down to the idea that the best thing to do might be to get both of your perspectives on why capitalism functions the way that it does, how it functions, first of all, as opposed to the way that it's ideally supposed to function, and then talk about why some of those myths persist about capitalism. And maybe, if we're really lucky, we will work towards a picture of something better in the future, because that's what I'm personally obsessed with. So,
obviously, there are different kinds of capitalism. And we're in finance capitalism, and what Steve and I are talking about really is the degeneration of the reversal of industrial capitalism away from its evolution into socialism, into finance capitalism and neo-feudalism and global disaster. It's supposed to work. It's supposed to create a global disaster, so 1% of the population owns everything else and can take over the 99%. Isn't that how it's supposed to work? Yeah, if you're one of the 1%. So it's supposed to work for whom?
Let's unpack that history a little bit, though, from the grand ideal to...
Have we started? Have we started?
We started recording at the very beginning, and then, we'll probably axe off the beginning until we get rolling exactly, but I honestly think we can just launch into it. I'd like to get both your perspectives on how these events unfolded to the place that we're at.
So before we get to the events that have unfolded, let's make sure that
we need to do that alignment.
Oh, we do need to do an alignment.
I'm sorry, we have one more technical thing.
All right, that's a good call. Okay, so I'm going to clap here, and then...
we use this to align the audio. So if each of you in turn, we can maybe start with Michael. If you could say say something with a P, like Karl Popper, perhaps.
Karl Popper.
Got it. And then Steve?
Peter Peck of Pickled Peppers.
There we go.
Nice. All right.
Okay.
I think that's all we
get
really
that
needed.
explosiveness that...
With a P.
That's all we need.
I'll go for Polanyi.
Okay. So...
No, not Popper.
I want us to start with making sure that everyone is on the same page for what we're talking about.
Yeah.
And so when we say that capitalism is broken or it's not working, do both of you have the same vision for what that means, or do you have slightly different perspectives or totally different perspectives on how it's broken?
What that word means? It's such a huge, powerful word in this discussion. We should probably define it as rigorously as possible.
Well, first of all, that's the wrong question. Working for whom? It's working very good if you're one of the 1%. It's working very badly if you're one of the 99%, or if you're living in a part of the world that rising sea levels is going to make uncomfortable, or if you're a renter, not a homeowner, or if you're a debtor, not a creditor. So it's working for whom is the first question.
What is it? What is capitalism? I know this is a very elementary question, but I think it's really important that we define that term up front.
The word capitalism was coined in the early 20th century by the German. I'm always blocking out his name right now. It's
Schumpeter.
No. Who wrote The Bourgeois? I'm blocking it all out. At any rate.
Yeah.
We'll think what most people think of as capitalism is what Marx wrote about, describing industrial capitalism, where the distinguishing feature is wage labor. Industrialists will hire labor to produce a good to sell at a profit. And the idea is for capitalists in one country to undersell those of other countries and continually to cut costs so that they can undersell their rivals. Modern finance capitalism is the opposite. Finance capitalism, Pentagon capitalism aims to maximize the cost of production. In Pentagon capitalism, you're paid an automatic 10% or similar proportion of whatever you spend money on. So the objective of Pentagon capitalism is, instead of making a $20 toilet seat, you make the famous $350 toilet seat, because then you get a $35 10% commission. Is that capitalism? The kind of capitalism we have today, if you want to say is capitalism what we now have, is finance capitalism. And that's the antithesis of industrial capitalism. Industrial capitalism sought to cut costs. And how do you do it? You do it by having government play a rising role. And the government will make sure that costs are not increased by monopolies, because any natural monopoly is going to be taken into the public domain. Communications, healthcare, education, transportation, all of these were developed by government and supplied to the private sector at a discount or even freely, so that the wage earners who were hired by the employers didn't have to spend their wages on healthcare or education. And that enabled American wages and German wages not to include all of these extra costs because of government. The ideal of industrial capitalism was revolutionary. It was to get rid of the rent seekers, to get rid of economic rent as unearned income, to get rid of the landlord class by taxing away land rent, to get rid of the monopolists by putting monopolies in the public domain, or at least regulating them. Well, what happened was the rent seekers fought back and gave us modern economics. And the modern economics said that government plays no major economic role. The one thing it picked up from industrial capitalism was, say, any problem there's a solution to. The solution to every single problem is one of two things. One, lower the wages of labor and its living standards. Two, get rid of government and let the private market solve everything, as long as the market is controlled by the financial interests. And the ideal of finance capitalism is to replace economic planning away from the government towards the financial sectors, and to maximize economic rent. And by the end of the 19th century, you had the modern economic saying markets are markets are ideal the way they are. Any attempt to change the natural market is an interference with the market. And the interference they meant was they didn't want socialism to develop. They didn't want economic regulation to develop. They didn't want anti-monopoly regulation to develop. They essentially wanted to create an economy run by the financial sector, making money by creating economic rent opportunities and deindustrializing. It's the objective of finance capitalism is to make money quickly with the least effort possible, and that does not mean you invest in a factory and develop markets. You take over a factory or a corporation, break it up, deindustrialize, turn the office buildings or factories into gentrified housing, and you remove all of the taxes on economic rent, on land rent, on monopoly rent, and essentially you create an economy that is just overblown, and in many ways is very much like the feudal economies, special interests, inherited rights, and the economy polarizes, and it polarizes primarily by debt, and so this post-industrial capitalism has sort of created a new idea of economics as its advertising, public relations effort. And this neoclassical anti-government economics says the ideal of any economy is to make money quickly as it is measured in financial form. And what we're seeing today in the United States is a huge upsweep in the financial wealth of the 1% of the population, while the 99% of the population is running into debt. So if you read the newspapers in the United States these days, it's all about why don't Americans realize what a wonderful thing that President Biden has done? The economy is doing wonderfully. Why do people say it's not doing wonderfully? Why are they so unhappy with the economy? Well, the reason is it depends on who is the economy that you're talking about. Are you talking about the economy for the 1%? Or the economy for the 99%. And the 1% are making money so rapidly at the expense of the 99% that overall wealth is actually going up. And so people think that the economy is doing good, but it's a very polarized, concentrated economy, just the opposite of what industrial capitalism aimed at.
Steve, do you have a different perspective on the history?
Well, I want to just I could see you were trying to absorb what Michael was saying there, and it's amazing to which a narrative will set how we think about a system. And Michael's narrative, I have much agreement with what Michael was saying. And there are elements I disagree with moderately, but the overall narrative Michael is making is, I think quite an accurate description of how capitalism, as it was originally seen, which was the industrial capitalism, has been distorted into financial capitalism. And that has worked out very well for those who own the financial assets and extremely badly for those who work, and to some extent extremely badly for those who manufacture as well. So you do have that. I think Michael's narrative is accurate, in other words. But I would also come back and say, well, what's the original distinction of capitalism from feudalism or from socialism? And that starts off with the private ownership of the means of production. Now, again, Michael and I would agree on that one. But what you get out of that is, in a modern society, there's no such thing as a perfectly private system. Okay? Never existed. There's always been a mix of private and public. And the question under capitalism, what would work better? And if you ask what would better in general, what Michael was talking about, where the government provides health, education, welfare, the infrastructure, et cetera, that means that workers aren't paying, as he said, for the cost of transportation to make a profit for the owner of transportation. They're paying a lower cost. They're getting free education, so the capitalists don't need to educate them, et cetera. And what you get, therefore, is a higher profit for those manufacturers. But financial capital is very much based on neoclassical economic thinking. Neoclassical economics didn't intend to be a defense for financial capital, but that's what's worked out. And when they say deregulate, they mean remove controls on the finance sector. So, therefore, I very much agree with Michael's perspective overall. But I think we have to then say, well, let's look at the systemic level: feudalism versus capitalism, capitalism versus socialism, and the private ownership of the means of production is an essential part of that. What you get, and this is in Michael's narrative as well, is a large part of what is done by the powers that be in capitalism makes it work less well than if they hadn't buggerized around with the system in the first place. And if you look back and see what was the period where, let's use America as our reference point, American population was happiest, and I'd say it's the Happy Days period, the 50s and 60s, which, the Happy Days show captured that. And you could have a single male worker most of the time supporting a large family and having plenty of leisure time, relatively. They didn't have they didn't have fancy things like this to talk on conversations across the internet, et cetera. The technological level is obviously lower, but you could support a family and have a reasonable family life and be working in an industrial setting as well, have pride in what you were doing as a worker, et cetera. Now, that's not America today. Okay? And so a lot of the sense of misery people get, even though you will get neoclassical economists in particular saying, oh, they're so much better off than they were back then because look at the cars they drive, well, that's technological change. And and that side of capitalism is one worth discussing. That's the main distinguishing feature, in one sense, between a feudal period and a capitalist. You have a greater rate of technological development during capitalism, and to some extent that benefits everybody. But you've had a breakdown. Financial capital has undermined what made capitalism great for the period that it was. And that's a large part of Michael's argument. And I've seen the data on that too. If you look at the level of private sector debt, you go, the booms and busts of private debt are what drive the apparent wealth and the final poverty of capitalism. We are now in the period of the highest level of private debt in America's history. And every time we get a high level of private debt like that, it's, you know, the old joke about if you owe the bank $100, you have a problem. If you owe the bank $1 million, the bank has a problem. Well, we've ended up where the bank dominates because we owe that $1 trillion. And the dominance of the finance sector, I think, is what's eroded the good side of capitalism. And that has been supported by conventional economic theory, even though they claim, of course, that they're not doing that.
Okay, now based on what Steve has said, I can see the question that should have been asked. What direction is capitalism going in?
Yeah.
And we could have said, what direction was industrial capitalism going in? Everybody in the 19th century said it's going towards socialism. There were many kinds of socialism, and the whole argument in the last decade of the 19th century was, what kind of socialism are we going to have? It's obvious that instead of having a post-feudal ruling class, a post-feudal landlord class to collect rent, a post-feudal monopoly class, and a predatory banking class, we're going to have government playing an increasing role, including money creation and control of the credit system. So that was going towards socialism. There was a counter-revolution, and that's the revolution that we've been having for the last century towards neoclassical, neoliberal economics, and that's finance capitalism. And that's going in the direction that precisely what Steve just pointed out. What is really growing under finance capitalism is debt. And the debt of the population as a whole is credit on the opposite side of the balance sheet. So while people now are talking about the growth of debt and the debt problem, it has a twin on the other side of the balance sheet that grows proportionally. The debts of the one group are the assets of another. So when Steve and I have both written about how the modern economic picture ignores debt and money because they say we owe the debt to ourselves. But who's the we and who's the ourselves? The debt that we owe, or the debt, the 99%, to ourselves, the 1%. So we're really getting a narrative by the 1%, and it's very largely a fictitious Orwellian doublespeak or narrative.
Was this kind of transition away from the happy days of the 50s and 60s inevitable because there was more money in the world and there was a greater need to put it somewhere where it would continue to accrue accrue value?
That's the kind of question an economist would ask.
We apologize for that comment.
Yeah.
I'm learning. I've talked to you guys for long enough.
Every economic tendency politicizes itself, and the problem is that as the financial class gets richer, what does it do? It takes over government. And it takes over policymaking, especially in the United States. You privatized the election process by the Citizens United ruling, where the nomination of political candidates is based on who can raise the most money from the donors. And so the head of every congressional committee, whether it's military or financing, the heads of the financial committee and the members are all received donations from the banks and the financial classes. The heads of the military committees all get subsidy by the military industrial complex. So this is the magic of the marketplace, is political. as well as just economic. That's what's changed things. The law has changed. The application of the law has changed. The culmination of finance capitalism, it peaked with President Obama, who you had the largest bank fraud in American history, and not a single bankster was sent to jail because the banksters nominate the judges. The banksters nominate the lawmakers. So you have economics is not simply the growth of debt or the growth of income. It's a mode. The economic power translates itself into political policy, regulation, and who staffs the regulators.
It seems like the political aspects feed back upon the financial structures as well, with things like you see the rise of ESGs being priced into corporate decision making. Is there a feedback loop at play there as well, where politics start to drive some of the financial decisions?
Oh, finance drives everything. I mean, we know the expression the military-industrial complex, and that was actually coined by General Dwight D. Eisenhower, President General Dwight D. Eisenhower, pretty much in his last day in office. And he, as a general, can certainly see not just from the point of view of the president, but having been in the military himself, the extent to which the industrial complex generated the strength of the military sector, and that ran American politics. What we have today, I think I call the financial political complex. The financial sector is the only part of the economy that has the ear of politicians. Politicians are persuaded by very self-serving arguments, which look convincing, but you cut beneath them and they're self-serving. And all the reforms, so-called, are about liberating finance. I just want to check, can I actually share my screen with you? Because I want to show some data, because most people have got no awareness of the level of private debt in America.
Let's try. Hold on. Hold on.
We have to change this.
I have to change a couple things. Pardon the interruption, dear listeners, but we must ask you for a favor. If you like what the Demystify Sci podcast does, consider coming over to our Patreon. It is at patreon.com/demystifysci, and there you can contribute a couple dollars a month to help us keep the ship running and allow us to continue our investigations into the most interesting ideas that are out there about nature, humans, history, the future, technology, economics, all of the things that we do on the podcast. In return for your donation, you get both of our episodes for the week early. You get to join our fantastic patron chat that meets weekly on Sunday mornings to talk about everything that is interesting in the world and the direction that the podcast should take. And you get to have the satisfaction of contributing to something that you think is important in the world. If you can't contribute right now, that is totally fine. We understand. I have been in that boat for many, many years. But what you can do without spending a single penny is come to our Discord, come to our Facebook, come to our Twitter, come to our Instagram, like, comment, and subscribe, because by helping us with the algorithm, you help us grow in a really super passive way. And if you've already joined the Patreon, just do all that other stuff too. For now, back to the conversation.
You can see the top graph is the ratio of private debt to GDP in America from 1947 to today. Okay, and it starts at about 50% of GDP back at the end of the Second World War. And then it just explodes cyclically, but explodes from 50% to 170%. And the financial crisis in 2007, 2008 occurred because the rate of growth of that debt turned from positive to negative. You went from a Ponzi scheme, the whole subprime thing, et cetera, Ultimately, that fell over because people could miss a payment. Suddenly, they go bankrupt, and the growth of debt goes the opposite way and drives house prices in the opposite direction. And you can see what I've done down here is I've taken the change in debt. So this is the level of debt, which is the dollars we owe. That's currently running at about $40 trillion, I think, in America, current level. This is the annual change in debt, and that's credit. Okay, the dollars per year that either you borrow or the financial sector encourages you to take on as debt. And that peaked at over 15% of GDP just before the crisis began. It went down to -5. Now that's repeating part of history that's been a part of America right back to the 1830s. You had the Great Depression, which was a more extreme version of this, and the Panic of 1837, which was more extreme again. But the level of debt's never been as high as it is this time round. And that's why we say we live in a financialized economy, and the numbers scream it. Now, what you get out of mainstream economic theory, this is the way in which Michael and I first bonded, because we approach the same issue from different directions. And we were about the only people in non-orthodox economics arguing the level of private debt mattered and credit was driving the economy. And I remember, Michael, you remember this conversation, I'm sure. I stayed in a hotel in New York, and you came to visit me, and we were raving away in my hotel room. And you finally said to me, "What is aggregate demand?" And I answered, now technically I'm slightly wrong here. I've since improved the argument. I answered it's GDP plus change in debt. And you said, why can't other people see that? And it is, in fact, now what it is credit is part of aggregate demand and aggregate income. And I've proven that analytically as well. So we now get the correct answer. If you leave credit out of your analysis of aggregate demand and aggregate income, you are not modelling capitalism. And mainstream economics has left it out all the way through and argues you don't need to look at it. Now, that's the reason I've done this bottom chart here, because the red line is the level of credit as a percentage of GDP mapped on the left-hand side of the chart, and the dotted line is the unemployment rate. Now, and that you can see one goes up, the other goes down. Rising credit gives you falling unemployment and vice versa. And the correlation between 1990 and 2015, which is the height of both the bubble, the burst, and then the aftermath, the correlation coefficient is greater than minus 0.9. R squared's about 0.83.
And so, and credit in this chart is personal debt that's being carried by people,
No,
or it's
mortgage
and corporation.
Debt? Oh, yeah.
Everything. It's household debt and corporate debt. Okay, of the non-financial sector to the banks. Okay, so it's even worse when you look at internal financial sector debt. The level is actually higher, but the data is badly defined. I just gave up on trying to include that data in my analysis. But this is how indebted the real economy, so to speak, households and firms, are to the financial sector. And because we've let the debt get this high, we've got, it's trebled, more than trebled. So the happy days were when debt was kept under control. And if you look at all the controls that came in after the Great Depression and the Second World War, they were to limit the capacity of the finance sector to do what they've been allowed to do in the 50s, 60s, and out through to today. So we want to tame financial capitalism, because if you want to have decent capitalism, you want industrial capitalism, not the finance sector going crazy. I'll stop my sharing now, but that's. It isn't just words, in other words, okay? We're both good talkers. Michael better than me. We're both good talkers. We're a good pair. But
we're best when we talk to each other and we bounce ideas off each other.
Yeah. And the data screamingly supports us. When I used to teaching it, before I met Michael, I was working over in the University of Western Sydney in Australia. And I was first starting to look at this information. And I would say to my students, I wouldn't dare make up the numbers that I actually find in the statistics if I was trying to make the case that I believe. In other words, the data is overwhelmingly stronger than I would dare to pretend it was if I didn't actually know the data. And so Michael and I were really led the battle in non-orthodox economics. We've got to focus upon financial capital, level of private debt, and its effects. And they've caught up with us to some degree, but we definitely led the battle on that front. And it means that we understand that capitalism, which we have now, is a perverted version of what it started as and what it should have stayed as. And Marx actually put it beautifully. This is in, I think it's in the third volume of Capital. I said, talk about centralization. The banks and the moneylenders and the parasites that surround them occasionally get the capacity to dominate the industrial capitalism, and this gang knows nothing about production and should have nothing to do with it. And he called them the roving cavaliers of credit. And that is what we've let take over. And Marx was right in that. If you'd had Marx managing capitalism, we would never have got the garbage we've got now. He had a naive vision of what socialism would be, but he would have kept the financial sector under control. And that's what we need to do to have a decent version of capitalism.
It occurs to me that there's this sort of false dichotomy set up in most people's minds, which regards the division between capitalism and socialism. But what we're talking about is the nuances of government restraints on the different industrial and financial sectors. Like there's a more nuanced dichotomy that should be at the center of people's attentions.
Well, the answer is yes. And Steve points out that he and I are almost the only people that continue to talk not only about debt, but the fact that the economy cannot recover until you cancel the debt. Well, the reason that economists don't want to talk about debt if they're representing the status quo is the old phrase, the devil wins at the point that the people believe he doesn't exist. The financial sector wins at the point where people think debt doesn't matter, debt problems don't exist, don't regulate it. There's nothing to see here, folks. Keep on moving. What I should have said is that at the very beginning is that industrial capitalism aims at creating profits, and it creates profits by employing labor to sell at a profit, and making profits means minimizing economic rent and minimizing predatory finance. Finance capitalism doesn't look for profits. That's why we're deindustrializing. It looks at economic rent seeking and financial gains. So the objective of these two forms of capitalism are diametrically opposite. And if you look at where they're going, this really is the problem. Are we going to have a society based on profits and wages and rising feedback between rising wages, higher productivity, and higher capital investment? Or are we going to have the finance capitalism just looking at how to get a free lunch at the economy's expense?
I don't know if you saw this World Economic Forum presentation where at the end of it, they made this point that in the future you will own nothing and be happy. And it's really stuck with me because it feels like there is a massive force that's kind of pressing on the lever arm of society to push people towards dematerializing their own lives. Well,
I guess that's the Obama doctrine. When he after the 2008 crisis, he said, we're going to start with nobody owning anything by evicting 10 million American families that have been fraudulently loaded down with junk mortgages. Let's first of all reduce home ownership by the Black and Hispanic population. Let's slash home ownership, and you've had since the Obama financial takeover, a plunge of 10 percentage points in America's home ownership rate. Yes, we're moving towards the polarization moves towards nobody will own anything, meaning nobody except the 1% will own anything, and they'll own everything.
But what we're caught up in as well is a battle between reality and ideology. And ideology is neoclassical economic theory and people who swallow its arguments all the way through. And if you go back to the 70s and 80s, that was when you had the real shift from a Keynesian understanding, which is like a bastardized version of a Marxian understanding, which at least appreciated classes exist and at least appreciated you wanted to get income to the working class because the working class will spend faster than the rich do. So if you actually distribute money to the working class, it ends up going to the capitalist anyway, ultimately. And you get, and this is actually what's called Kalecki's profit equation, that says that if you increase government spending, ends up in the pockets of capitalists. Because you give it to workers, they'll spend it, and it ends up in Walmart, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the thing is, if you do that, that's better than giving it to the capitalists directly, or certainly financial capital. They spend much more slowly. So what you get out of it is, even though it ends up being something which capitalists profit from, you get a better level of economic activity, a larger level of economic activity, if it goes through the workers in the first place. Workers have to spend the money they've got very rapidly. Capitalists and bankers spend it very slowly, even though they've got far more money. So what's happened is a switch to the money going to the workers, which gave us the buoyant economy of the 50s and 60s, the happy days capitalism, where it goes to the ultra wealthy now. And they buy, they used to buy Lamborghinis, now they buy top level Teslas. They've got yachts everywhere. They compete over the size of the yachts they've got. It's a much more, as Michael said earlier, a feudal type economy we've generated. And the point I want to make, I'm going to share my screen again, by the way. This is a very heavy looking piece of data here. But one of the things which was sold to get a change like we got out of Thatcher and Reagan, you've got to have something which gets the popular support. So you get people voting for it. Part of that comes out of the Murdochs of the world pushing their views and so on. But what they were saying is get rid of trade unions, get rid of government interference, get rid of socialised medicine and socialised education. And what we're going to get is a booming economy that grows much faster. And even though you won't have a welfare state holding your hand or putting a net beneath you, you're going to have a faster rate of growth and you'll be wealthier. Okay. So what that tells you is their argument was the economy would grow faster if we move from the type of capitalism Michael was talking about earlier, where the government covered a lot of those costs, to one where everything is privatised. That was supposed to increase the rate of economic growth. Now, I could show a screen. Was it worth trying again?
Yeah, you should be good to go now.
Yeah.
I think we got it set
Okay,
up.
give it a try. Okay, just hang on a second. So share the same screen. This is my software package Ravel, by the way, Michael. Now, there's a lot of charts on this one, but I want to just zoom in to show you the growth rate.
Makes it all clear.
Okay. So what you can see, this is for America, and the growth rate from 1945 to 1975 was roughly 3.25%, 3.25% per annum, real economic growth. From 75 on, it's been 1.9%. Okay. That's virtually halving the rate of growth, which of course means that the level of economic activity now after many, many years is far lower than it would have been if we continued with the old so-called inefficient Keynesian system. So they've sold us a pup. We've bought the pup, and the trouble is nobody realizes. I'll see I've got a few bugs with the software, but I'll try going to another country here. Let's try Japan, for example, and see if I can update the data.
While you're working that out, I wonder. So if the switch to financial capital has been this artificial method by which to grow GDP by seeking rent from the working class, why doesn't the growth of GDP reflect that calculation? Like, why does it slow down?
It's not a growth of GDP. It's a growth of ownership of capital, ownership of resources, and the concentration of wealth. So we've actually grown more slowly. If you gave the money to the workers and they were spending it in a happy days form, there'd be a high rate of economic growth. That's what they told us they'd get. They didn't get the high rate of growth. We're now slumping, but they're much, much wealthier, and we're all complaining about it, and we're right and they're wrong. Michael.
Well, two things about that. When President Biden gave money for the COVID people, I guess that was President Trump who did that, the workers used their money to pay down their credit card debt. Because what's growing is debt. You've talked about the growth of GDP, and what's happened is that finance capitalism transforms the concept of GDP. It erases the distinction between what is a product and what is overhead. For instance, right now in America, as a result of this growing debt, arrears and foreclosures are increasing for housing, for automobiles, and for credit card debt. Defaults of loans are rising. Now, what happens when you default on a credit card loan? Your interest rate goes up from 19% a year to about 30% a year. The credit card companies now make more money in penalties than they make in interest. And what they make in penalties is recorded in the GDP is providing financial services. So the more you lose your money, you lose your house, you pay higher financial rates. This is considered economic growth, not overhead. All of the money, the high wages that CEOs pay themselves, the monopoly prices that are charged for Amazon and for the other companies under federal prosecution right now for being monopolies, all of this is economic growth. What is growing is the financial tumor, not the economy as a whole, not the industrial economy. Again, that's why the U.S. economy is deindustrializing, and they call that economic growth because the financial sector is making a fortune off deindustrialization.
And this is actually a problem with how the flow of funds tables were defined way back in the 40s. It was Copeland who defined them, a statistician Michael and I both have a lot of respect for. But the mistake he made was he decided to record, if with industrial capitalism, you can record the number of cars going out the factory door times the price. Okay, if you get a physical measure of the profit, you get the capital, you purchase the machinery, you've got all these prices, and it's all solid and real. But how do you include the finance sector? And he decided simply to call the contribution of the finance sector to GDP the sum of the finance sector, all the wages that are paid, all the bonuses, all the profits that are made. So if you double the pay of a CEO, you increase GDP. Now that's wrong. We should have said, let's look at it and see. One of my students way back at my University Western Sydney days put it beautifully. He said, "Is finance a profit centre or a cost?" And the answer is it's cost of doing business. It's not a profit centre. We've made the mistake of seeing it as being creative. And therefore, and that's also, unfortunately, the way the Copeland defined those accounts. Rather than having a negative for the financial sector, which would have made sense, he made it a positive, as if it adds to profit, adds to GDP. And what has happened, of course, it's grown enormously. So the finance sector has gone from something of the order of, I don't have the exact numbers, but say like about 5% of GDP to 15% of GDP. And we've counted that as growth. But as Michael said, it's not a growth, it's a tumour. Past a certain level, you do need finance to enable all the transactions we do on a daily basis. You need borrowed money if you're going to buy a large item like a house or a car, et cetera, et cetera. It does make sense to have a certain level of financial debt in a capitalist economy, but not 3 times what it was in the 50s.
And this financial bias is the denial that there is any such thing as economic rent. Post-industrial capitalism theory says everybody earns whatever income they get. So, as I think I said it on the earlier broadcast on our show, when the head of Goldman Sachs says, our partners are the most productive workers in the American economy. Look at how much our partners are paid as we rob companies, pull them apart, create international crimes by stealing Malaysia's foreign money. The most money is to be made in crime. We know that, and we're the best criminals there are, financial criminals, which is why they were prosecuted. Well, if you say that everybody earns what they get, no matter how they earn it, there's no such thing as unearned income, no economic rent, then you've negated the entire 19th century political economy. All of the value and price theory of the 19th century, that was the essence of industrial capitalism, was to distinguish earned from unearned income so that they could free capitalism from the landlord class, from the monopolies, and from the predatory bankers. And the counter-revolution that began a century ago, and in which we are still living, denies this distinction so that, again, the devil has made himself invisible.
You look back at Ricardo, because people would know Ricardo for the theory of comparative advantage. Now, that was one of I call it the shell and pea trick, because he managed to deceive everybody. And economists, that's been the one trick pony that economics have been since, is using the idea of specialization. But what his real purpose for putting that argument forward was that he argued that workers get the means of subsistence. Capitalists, you want capitalists to get a profit because capitalists will invest. And if you want to have a longer period of growth before what he saw as being a stationary state in the future, then you want to get as much money into the hands of the capitalists so that they'll invest, and as little as possible into the landlords. So if you read him carefully, he says, my purpose in this book has been to show, S-H-E-W, to show that wherever rents go down, profits go up, effectively. I haven't got the quote right there. But what he's saying, if you can reduce the amount that goes to rent, you'll get a higher rate of growth, and you'll have a longer period of prosperity before the stationary state. So he was anti-landlord, which is hilarious because he actually was a landlord. But nonetheless, that was the flavour of Smith. It was the flavour of Ricardo, certainly Marx. And the whole idea was to minimise rentier behaviour. And if you look back and see what the feudal system was, that was the ultimate of rentier behaviour. So that's where the anti-feudal, pro-capitalist elements exist in all the classical school. And the neoclassicals had this fantasy view of capitalism to begin with, but they're the ones who threw away the distinction. And then that, of course, very much suited the wealthy. And so Michael, you probably know a lot more about this than I do, but the takeover of economics in the 1870s from the classical school to the neoclassical school, where virtually in about a decade, you went from the classical school being the dominance and the neoclassicals being the undergrowth to all the professors of economics being a neoclassical.
Well, it was largely in the 1890s. John Bates Clark in America and similar people, the Austrians abroad. It was a whole counter revolution. That's basically what you had.
Yeah, and that meant we went from a generally fairly realistic picture of capitalism under the classical school of economic thought, and then one that ends up with the type of capitalism we had in the 50s and 60s, which is largely an accident more than deliberate, to the financial capital side. And the neoclassical economic theory justifies all that by saying that the ludicrous pay being paid to people managing financial organizations is because they have a high marginal product. And that says capitalism meritocracy, which is bullshit.
Well, since Steve mentioned Ricardo, when our generation went to school, they still taught the history of economic thought. That is now stripped away from the curriculum. The one thing they don't teach is that there ever was a theory of economic rent. They don't talk about Ricardo or the whole 19th century. They've replaced the history of economic thought with mathematics, as if you can just mathematize the existing statistics that have all been, as Steve pointed out, restructured so as to deny that there's any distinction between the financial economy and real industry. So you have economists being turned out that are very smart mathematically, but they don't know what to be smart about because they've never been exposed to the idea that there is such a thing as economic rent, unearned income, and debt crises.
So I want to talk about the way that debt...
mathematically.
Steve, what was that?
Sorry. I wouldn't call them smart.
Clever. What shall we say? Oh, idiot savants.
Numerate. They're very numerate.
Definitely the word.
Quantitatively reasonable.
Yeah. Quantitatively able. So
yes, as if Robert McNamara was running the economy like he ran the war.
I want to understand better why debt is so stifling, because in the back of my mind, I'm kind of like, well, why can't it just continue to go on eternally? Like, why can't we just have debt?
You're talking about national debt?
National debt, personal debt, economic debt, just like, why can't it just perpetually grow and grow and grow? And if everybody's debt is growing and everybody's kind of looking at it and is like, well, that's just a thing that grows. It's fine.
It's growing faster than everything else. This is the problem. If debt grew at the same rate of GDP, we wouldn't be having this conversation. Okay? And government debt is different. That's a point worth elaborating on shortly. But private debt, if private debt was growing as fast as GDP, it'd be the same ratio. And therefore, you'd be right, it could continue growing. What we're talking about, the ratio has grown dramatically. And then what's happened, it's gone from being a servant of capitalism to a parasite of capitalism. And it's slowed down the capacity of the industrial capitalism to develop new products. And like the first example we ever saw of that was actually Japan. Because if you go back to the post-war period for Japan, you had the enormous, Japanese miracle, as they call it, dramatic growth in the economy. And then between 1980 and 1990, they had what they literally call it the bubble economy, where people were speculating on the value of houses in Tokyo, so that the Imperial Palace, which I think has got an area of about 10 square kilometers, roughly, maybe less than that, was worth more than California. You had the Nikkei reach almost 40,000 points on the 31st of December, 1989. It since fell to about 7,000 points. But this financial bubble took over. Now, up until that point, up to 1990, you would see movies like, what was they called, the Rising Sun? A classic, it was Denzel Washington, was it? A very classic movie about Japan taking over everything. And we had Walkmans, et cetera, et cetera. What happened? Well, Japanese corporations tended to operate as collectible suits. So rather than being equity finance, they were largely debt finance. But there was a symbiotic relationship, but also independent at the same time. Well, those Japanese corporations had so much debt that they've spent most of the period since 1990 paying off that debt. And the industrial development, the technological development that we associated with Japan died in the arse. And so that's what got rid of them. And we had that
who did they
warning
owe their
from
debt
Japan.
to?
Pardon? The Japanese corporation. The Japanese corporation owed it to Japanese banks. The level of private debt in Japan went from about like 30% of GDP and sort of fairly flat for quite some time through the 70s and 80s, rose to 225% of GDP. And then after the crisis, is now back down to about the same level as America, which is about 170% of GDP. So when you let debt get out of hand, you stifle everything in the real economy: investment, technological development, and happiness.
This can easily be charted. You have the key for financial debt is debt grows by compound interest. I can send you and while the economy grows at an S curve, it tapers off. And the reason it tapers off is as debt grows at compound interest, there's a gap. And more of the output of wages and profits have to be paid to the creditors as interest. And the more you pay in interest and amortization to the creditor class, the less you have to pay on goods and services. The most sophisticated mathematical model of this was in Babylonia in 1750 BC. The Babylonians had a very clear model because we have the textbooks that they taught for their scribes. They asked, how fast does a debt grow at compound interest? Well, at 20%, every debt doubles in 5 years. It quadruples in 10 years. It multiplies eightfold in 15 years, and on. But the economy, they have how fast does a herd of cattle grow, and they have it tapering off. And when modern translators first looked at these, they thought, oh, this must be just actual statistics, but they actually taught it in the model that the rate of debt exceeds the ability to pay. So what do you do with such a model? Well, it's very simple. Hammurabi wiped out all of the personal debts 4 times during his rule. Not commercial debts. Commercial debts owed by businesses to each other stayed in place, but you need a debt write-down. If you look at the statistics that Steve just put up on the growth of debt, the only way in which you can prevent this debt from causing a chronic depression, what Irving Fisher called debt deflation in the 1930s, is to write down the debt. Well, if you look at today, the former head of the Federal Reserve, Ben Bernanke, was given the Nobel Prize for saying that there's no such thing as debt deflation. Irving Fisher was wrong. So they give the Nobel Prize. I think if we give enough prizes to idiot savants who mislead the economy, then maybe people will think if they have a prize, they're a celebrity, and why listen to Steve and Michael, who are never going to get the Nobel Prize? Because if they gave us the Nobel Prize, they'd have to cancel all the prizes they've given for the last 50 years.
And the Nobel Prize, I don't know if you guys know this, is not a Nobel Prize. Are you aware of that?
Right. Yes.
In what sense?
That's why I asked. Nobel, the Alfred Nobel, established the prize in chemistry, physics, literature, and peace. I think there's the 4 prizes, not economics. And he actually specifically considered and said it wasn't a science. It shouldn't be given a prize. In 1969, the Swedish central bank was fighting, headed by neoclassical economists, was fighting a battle to prevent the social democratic politics that we tend to still associate with Sweden. And they came up with the idea of having a prize, which is called, I can't pronounce the name of the bank in Swedish, the Swedish Central Bank Prize in Economics in honor of Alfred Nobel, 1969. That's when it started. Everybody they've selected, bar a few, a handful of many rebels, so that they can sort of quieten down dispute occasionally. But it's been to strengthen the neoclassical vision all the way through. So
it strikes me as a bigger problem too with Nobel Prizes, which is how do you walk back on something? Like, science in general, knowledge, the acquisition of knowledge is always changing. The way we see things is changing. And I don't know how that's kind of one of the dangers of giving these monumental prizes, is that you don't have the ability to change your mind anymore, which is really dangerous to progress.
We can't withdraw a prize. I think they should, if it was possible to withdraw a prize, the two prizes I'd most want to withdraw are William Nordhaus's prize in 2018 for the so-called economics of climate change. I only read his shit, and that's my technical description of what he wrote. I only read his shit after he got the prize and realized how bad it was. I'd read Bernanke's before the prize. When I saw they're given that guy's been given the prize for an approach, a model of lending, which the Bank of England said is garbage in 2014. The Bundesbank said is garbage in 2017. Literally said the textbooks are wrong, and they give a prize to this guy 5 years later after the Bundesbank. So it is just a sign of how it's an ideology. It's not a science.
But that's why it's given, and that's why it's named for Nobel. Nobel invented dynamite, which is how he made the fortune to support it. The Nobel Prize is for intellectual dynamite. It blows up the understanding of the economy to leave devastation in its wake.
For Nobel, I want to understand something about the way that profits become accumulated at the peak of the credit structures, because we were talking about the way that debt grows and the financial system makes most of its profits off of servicing that debt. And I guess I'm trying to understand what actually happens to the money that's accumulating there. Like, does it get paid out as salaries? Does it just live in the bank and then allow the bank to then progressively ratchet up its influence on the economy? Or like, what happens? Like, if it's debt and it's being calculated as part of the economy and somebody's accumulating it, is it real wealth that's getting spent, or is it just sitting on a ledger somewhere being accounted for but not being used?
Oh, you love to ask trick questions. What they count as profit is what anybody earns, whether they earn it or it's unearned economic rent. Financial, let's say revenue, which is the word that the classical economists use. The financial revenue, what do banks do? They relend it and yet more debt. That's why debt grows exponentially. All of the revenue of that the banking financial sector earns is reinvested in yet more debt, to indebt the economy yet more, siphoning off yet more revenue from industry and from wage earners. So there's even less and less and less money to spend on the goods and services that they produce, and you create economic shrinkage. So it's not industrial profits that grow; it's the profits of the rentiers and the monopolists. And if you don't believe there's any such thing as economic rent or monopoly rent or landlord rent or financial rent, then to you, it's all the same thing. There's no distinction at all.
Can we break apart the distinction between economic, financial, landlords, like all of these different types of rents?
What they have in common is they're unearned. And as John Stuart Mill said, landlords make their rent in their sleep. Well, so do financial investors who hold bonds or mortgages. They make their rent without enterprise, without earning. They play no role in the process of production, employment, and reinvestment and economic growth. They simply obtain a special privilege, a monopoly privilege, the privilege of being a creditor, and instead of having the government as the creditor, as you have in China. And as long as they're unearned.
But surely there's a role for rent, right? There must be a role. I mean, when kids come out of the house at 18, they're not going to be able to afford a house under any economic structure that I can imagine. So, do you imagine just? Go ahead.
There's a role for rental, but you have to constrain it. So there's a role for debt, but you have to constrain it. Michael's point earlier about the Sumerian, and Michael knows this is his area's expertise, not mine. But what you had in that vision was you had an agricultural society, you had physical bounds on your plots, So if you start farming somewhere, you're going to reach the boundaries at some point. But if you're borrowing and you've got to pay really high compound interest, that's going to rise exponentially. And what happened is this is me telling Michael's work. So pardon me, mate. I want to just elaborate on your idea. The debts of corporate debt, people doing trading, that wasn't abolished. That was left as it was, because that was a corporate decision. But most of these debts run up in mead halls, or they were run up with failures of crops and so on. And there were such high rates of interest, they'd necessarily grow faster than the productivity of the fields that were actually supporting it. Now, the downside for the emperor at that stage was only free men could fight in the army. So the more debt that occurred, the more people became wage slaves, had to go and work on the land of the landlord. And if that continued long enough, there'd be no army to fight off the other empires, and you'd collapse. So there was a strong reason for the state to come in and say, we're going to abolish these debts. You could go back and be free men back on the land you lost because of the debts you ran up in the meat hall or through failed harvests, and you'd replenish and regenerate. And if you look, and this again is Michael's work, you look at the history of human civilization from way back those 3,000 years BC right through the Roman period to today, a huge part of what we see in all sorts of great men theories of conflict have really been struggles between debtors and creditors. And the political power now is in the hand of the creditors. And that's what gives you a society which ultimately undermines itself. And that's what we're seeing now.
So it sounds like you're saying that if we bring back debtors' prisons and we imprison the large majority of people that have debt, all of a sudden we'll create the incentive structure for canceling the debt, because there's literally not going to be anybody to work anymore.
Well, if you could still vote in jail, I mean, yeah, you won't, of course, but it is the extent to which political power rests with those who own the money. And if you let them, they are their own worst enemies in the long run. So even though they're dominating, they're the 1%, or the 0.01% really, they're the ones who are benefiting out of the current system. Their decisions about how to run it are undermining its viability.
Well, the problem is that the financial sector doesn't have a long run. They live in the short run. It's a hit and run. That's the problem. They don't care about the long run. They'll say, well, we'll do something else when we wreck this economy. They'll move on to another. And you can see this most of all in the international economy. The global South debt, dollar debt. How is it ever going to be paid? All of this was debated in the 1920s with German reparations and inter-allied debts. And all of that's been expunged from the economics curriculum. And I went all the way through a PhD without ever hearing a word about debt or the debt crises. It's not talked about in polite company.
Yeah, so that's something that I wanted to go into, which is the eventual pressure not just on a bank on its own people, but this gradual push towards the bank pressuring other countries and affecting their ability to make freely self-determined choices. And it seems like an extension of just resource extraction, because the terms of the loans are often extortionist, and so one generation agrees to the term of the loans, another generation is paying it off, and it promotes poverty and the ability to just extract the wealth from a country that has agreed to something that maybe it didn't really understand to begin with, or was forced to.
Yeah. Since Steve talked a lot about global warming, before I talk about third world debt, I want to talk about why neoliberalism has a financial center, and it's America. And America's balance of control over the international economy is very much by control of the oil industry. The financial sector makes loans to whatever sector can afford to pay the most interest back, and the most I won't say profitable, the most rent-intensive sector is the oil sector. Every dollar of oil investment abroad is repaid in balance of payments terms in 18 months. At least that's what I found in the only study of the oil industry that's been done. So the one of the aims and objectives of finance capitalism is to speed up global warming and to control the world economy by being able to turn off any country's oil electricity, and economic power, and hence its growth of GDP as well as warming houses. It will if it can control the oil trade. That's why the United States blew up the pipelines with Russia. If the United States can control the oil trade of the world, then it can essentially have a stranglehold on the economy. And that's why the United States' prime aim in diplomacy is we will disable any attempt to slow global warming, accelerating global warming, preventing an alternative to oil, gas, and coal is a key to America's ability to control the world economy. And Steve has done all the numbers on that.
Well, I mean, I blame particular Americans, not just America in general, for global warming. William Nordhaus being one of the main ones. I can't think of the guy's name, but a physicist as well who worked for the government and talked the government out of worrying about global warming back in the 70s and 80s, which is why America's done nothing about it. But yeah, again, this is a point of the short-termedness of capitalism, and why that's so damn dangerous, of the financial sector in particular, because they're all on 3-month reporting. At best, they look 5 years in the future. And I'm speaking from personal experience here, in that I've written a report called "Loading the Dice Against Pensions," which points out the extent to which neoclassical economics, in the form of William Nordhaus's models and all the models that have been generated around by his cabal of neoclassical economists, trivialize the dangers of climate change with the worst research I've ever seen in my life. Okay, dreadful stuff, should never have been published. But the impact of saying, and just pointing out how badly these pension funds have been advised by consultants who relied upon the economic research. The barrier I've come up against is say, well, yeah, but that's outside our investment horizon. That's more than 5 years in the future. Now, if civilization is going to be destroyed in 6 years, that's outside their investment horizon.
I wouldn't expect civilization to be destroyed in 6 years, though. I would expect that there would be a perpetual decay that you see in advance. And so if you look at your 5-year window and it starts to just trend down for the next, for the last 10 5-year windows, then you're looking at the decay. And is that kind of how they use to justify?
No. They just, if it doesn't affect their current profit and loss statements and the 3-year reporting and 5-year reporting and so on, then they're not going to be bothered about it. Now, that means that you only start realizing, global warming is affecting us, we should do something about it, when it's too late. You can't have that time horizon to survive something of the nature of global warming. And economists have played an enormous role in trivializing the dangers. And when capitalism collapses, and I'm using when, not if, when capitalism collapses, it'll be the fault of the economists, neoclassical economists, not the radicals. The people that are going to bring capitalism down are the ones who think they're its friends.
Okay, so when you say that capitalism collapses, what do you see? Neo-feudalism, or you see something totally different?
Mad Max.
I mean, that's very romantic, but...
No, it's not romantic. I'm looking forward to dying before it happens. I mean, and I can't, if you, having watched COVID in particular and seeing the catastrophe that our so-called leaders made of that, if you didn't have experts at all in charge of anything at any point, when you had idiots like Boris Johnson, who's being exposed in a COVID inquiry in the UK right now, the stupidity of the decisions that were made. To imagine that we're going to realise there's a threat and then organise collectively and do the right thing and just manage to save ourselves in the nick of time is a Hollywood movie. It ain't going to happen.
What is happening is that the world is now dividing into two halves. You have the golden billion, the garden of the Anglo-Saxon world, Europe and America, and you have the jungle. That's how the head of Borrell at the European Union expresses it. The jungle is the 75% of humanity. China, Russia, Iran, the BRICS plus countries. They are the groups led by China that are moving towards socialism. And what makes China so uniquely different from the capitalist countries is they have kept money creation and banking and credit as a public utility in the government hands. So in America, when a corporation goes bankrupt, it's closed down, it's sold, and dismantled. In China, if you're the creditor, China is the one country where it's politically possible to cancel the debts without creating a political crisis, because if you're the government, you're canceling debts owed to yourself. It's always easier to cancel the debts owed to themselves, which is why Hammurabi in Babylonia was able to write them down, because the palace and the temples were the creditors, not a privatized financial class. So the privatized financial class in the West has essentially replaced the landlord class. The major source of debt and credit is now mortgage loans in the West. 80% of American and British loans are mortgage loans for real estate. So there isn't a landlord class anymore, but still land rent has created a rent-seeking class, although it's a rent-seeking financial class, not a landlord class. But China has the ability to right now cope with the fact that its real estate prices are also collapsing. But it doesn't have to evict the homeowners. It can just either write down the debts, or it can let the private banks that have borrowed from the Central Bank of China and lent out money to the big real estate companies like Evergrande and Country Garden that have overbuilt. It can let the banks go under. And the good thing about letting the banks go under is you wipe out all of the large depositors. You move towards equalizing the income. And that is the beauty of canceling the debt, is you cancel the savings of this predatory 1% financial class that you want to. So you benefit the debtors and you benefit society by removing the creditors from their position of trying to take power and dismantle government's attempt to regulate them and create an overall prosperity.
Is there any modern precedent for debt cancellation?
Yes, 3,000 years of every Near Eastern ruler, not only Sumerian, but Babylonian, every Near Eastern kingdom, even Assyria, canceled the debts, and the Babylonian.
Michael, I know you're older than us, but I feel like Sumerian Babylonia isn't a fair example of modern debt cancellation.
Yeah, what would the modern version of that look like? Like, how would that even unfold? Who would have the power to pull that off?
Have you privatized
Germany's economic miracle in 1948, when they wiped out all debt except for the debt that employers owed their employees for the last week or month or two, and everybody was allowed to keep a few thousand marks in the bank. So the Germany wrote down the debt because most of the creditors were Nazis, and the debts were owed to the Nazis. So it's easy when you don't treat the Nazis. The problem is that we don't treat Goldman Sachs and Chase Manhattan as financial Nazis, and we're not willing to write down the debts owed to them as the Allies were willing to write down the German debts in 1948 that started the economic miracle.
Michael and I have been pushing this point for decades now, that if you want to get capitalism to function well, you reduce private debt. Okay, that's the private debt and unearned income are the two things you want to get minimize to enable capitalism to grow. And it's done by accident for the Germans after World War II. And that was in reaction to what the disaster they caused when they did the opposite after World War I. So that's the Marshall Plan was the last time America acted with intelligence in the international sphere. And the benefits of that were huge. Now we're trying to say the same thing. You could actually reduce private debt by using the government's capacity to create money and cancel private debts in what I call the modern debt jubilee. And I've done the modeling and all this, and Michael and I've spent a long time discussing it. The idea was you'd give everybody an equal amount of money, which means I'd get the same amount of money as Rupert Murdoch. Okay, and then if you had any debt, you'd have to pay it down. If you didn't have any debt, you'd get a cash injection, which you could either spend or you could have controls over it in terms of asset ownership if you didn't want to cause a huge inflationary surge. And if you did that, you'd reduce the level of private debt dramatically. Government debt can be carried easily, and when I've simulated it, government debt also falls ultimately because the rate of turnover of money rises so much because workers suddenly have money without debt, so they can suddenly spend. You get a greater level of economic growth coming out of it, so you reduce the debt ratio over time as well. So it's quite feasible to do it, and it'll never happen. Okay, because if only America's armies could only be staffed by people who didn't have debt, then maybe America would agree to cancel household and private debt. Otherwise, it couldn't invade other countries. But unfortunately, that's not the case.
Wouldn't the banks collapse if you canceled private debt? Because I mean, a lot of the banks are
they have to sack a lot of workers earning ridiculous salaries. That wouldn't be a bad thing. Have to go and get a factory job.
The banks would be, as they did under Roosevelt, there'd be a bank holiday, they'd reopen the next day, but the uninsured depositors, the billionaires, would no longer have their money. And again, that's a good thing, not a bad thing, because they haven't used their billions of dollars very well.
I don't model that happening. I model that everybody gets the same amount of money. Money doesn't get destroyed. You have the same amount of money, but you end up backing the money rather than being backed by private debt. It's backed by government money creation capability. You go from credit-based money to fiat-based money. You could leave the same amount of money in there in the overall system, but by reducing the debt on a per capita basis, you benefit the poor far more than you benefit the rich. And that's the idea behind it. I wanted something which is politically palatable. You could actually sell it to 90% of the population would be better off. The trouble is you simply can't get this idea discussed anywhere in any circles apart from when Michael and I get together. It is not even discussed. And economic theory is a major reason why, because if you try to argue to Ben Bernanke that you should reduce the level of debt, pure redistribution should have no significant macroeconomic effects. That's from the paper after he got the paper he wrote after the one he got the Nobel Prize for. So economic theory is what's preventing a sensible reform of capitalism. And in terms of the global warming, it's what's setting us up for the physical demise of capitalism as climatic change destroys sedentary civilizations. So, the greatest enemy of capitalism is neoclassical economics.
Think of it as debt pollution. And debt pollution is like environmental pollution. It grows and grows and grows and stifles growth.
But I'm still thinking about it in terms of just how much money you'd have to actually pay people. I was looking at this recently. The average personal debt in the United States is $30,000, and that's like for every man, woman, and
the average 50% of Americans don't have any savings at all. That's the key. Look at who has the savings. If you always look at both sides of the balance sheet. If you think of economics in terms of balance sheets, not just one side, you get the basic dynamics. When you talk about debt, also look at savings. 50% don't have any savings, and the average American can only raise $400 in an emergency, according to the Federal Reserve statistics. So, what happens when there's an emergency? They go further and further into debt because they can't pay for it. That's really the problem that we're in. So it's not the amount of money. A lot of money is the savings of the 1%, is the concentration clotting at the top of the economic pyramid.
I mean, I just looked it up. The average household debt, as reported by the Motley Fool at the end of 2022, was $100,000.
Well, most of that would be real estate debt. And the reason there's this real estate debt is because of the failure of the 19th century to achieve its main economic objective, which was to finance government not by taxing profits or wages, but by taxing land rent. And if all of the increase in land prices as a result of prosperity, population growth, and public spending, if all of this increase in prices were not given away to the landlords freely, but were collected as the government, then this rent would not be available to pledge to the banks to pay interest. So simply taxing away land rent would prevent the financialization of land valuations, which is what most of the debt is in the United States. There's no need at all for this debt. Instead of paying an income tax by the wage earners and the companies, they'd be paying a rent tax on the land, and this rent would not be used to pay interest.
Interesting. So you look like you have something you want to ask.
Well, it just seems to me like there's two ways to look at the solution set to this. One is a post-collapse narrative, and one of them is something like what individuals right now can do in order to promote a better financial structure in the future. Like, are there things that people can actually do to take, for instance, not taking on debt? Is that a solution that people can actually contribute to this whole, or is that an impossible wish?
Not if you need it to break even. If the break-even costs force you to go into debt, then the economy is malstructured. A well-structured economy wouldn't force you to go into debt. It wouldn't force you to pay higher and higher debt service to the banks to buy a home to live in, because it could be the same home that's been there for 100 years. If that's going up in price, there's no reason to have the banks earn money interest in their sleep by forcing you into debt to pay the land rent to the banks that can simply create the credit.
So in that sense, all of our entire solution set is bounded in a top-down view that we fundamentally have to restructure the system in order to actually get out of this hole. There's
That's
nothing
exactly what
do.
Adam Smith and Ricardo and John Stuart Mill and Marx and all of the classical free market was all about. A free market is a market free of economic rent. And now it's a market, it's free for the rentiers to take as much as they want without government regulation or taxation.
This is the point that, looking back at when classical economics first evolved, it was a fighting the feudal system and arguing in favor of capitalists. Now, the feudal system was overwhelmingly landlords. You might be lord landlord, but you were still a landlord. So your wealth came out of land ownership, and they saw that as unproductive. And they wanted to direct the wealth from the landlord class to the capitalists. And that gave you an unearned income perspective of the classical school of economics. And what's happened with the neoclassical taking over, they've abolished that distinction. Everything is your marginal product. And therefore, the landlords, if you're a wealthy landlord, you've got a large marginal product. It's everything is a meritocracy. The classical school focused on the fact that wealth came out of ownership, not out of what you did. And with the neoclassicals, have abolished the whole idea that ownership has any role at all, which is crazy because we're talking about capitalism.
I think that we should take a short break right here and refill coffee and maybe use the bathroom, because afterwards I want to get into a historical picture of how this happened, because what you guys are saying is that we went from feudalism to capitalism, and now we're going from neoclassical economics, which took over from classical economics, back into
like a financial feudalism.
Neo-feudalism. And so I want to see if we can learn something by looking at that first transition and the one that's happening now, to see if we can accelerate the transition back out of it. There's one more thing that I wanted to mention. We are organizing our very first conference, Demysticon 2024, which we're going to hold in Austin, Texas, April 7th and 8th of next year. We're going to have 2 days of talks on astrophysics, cosmology, mythology, archaeology, economics, consciousness, with some of our favorite guests from the podcast. The link for that is down in the description. It's also going to be up here in just a second. But if you have that weekend available and you are interested in joining us, please come over to our Eventbrite and purchase tickets now. If you cannot attend by coming in person, that's totally fine. We also have tickets available for the live stream. So check that out right up here.
I was just saying in the break to Anastasia that when I listen to other podcasts by non-economists and they talk about the financial crisis in America, let's say just the this sort of impoverishment of the average person. The idea is that the dichotomy is between socialism and the government stealing up people's money or something, and capitalism, free market capitalism. And I think that that's not the right dichotomy to be examining. I think we established that pretty early on. But why does that myth persist? Why is that something that most people on the street understand to be the dichotomy?
And I imagine that it must be something of a historical artifact because it's a reflection of the most recent economic conflict, which is, Soviets versus Americans, or if you go even farther back, it's Karl Marx and the development of rising up to own the means of production. And so everybody just kind of fits it onto this pattern and just don't go any deeper than that.
Well, there are many kinds of socialism, just as there are many kinds of capitalism. The idea of socialism prior to World War I was, as we said, the government was going to help industrial capitalism, and it was the industrialists that were pressing for socialism, in the sense of they were pressing for government to provide as many public services as public utilities as they could in order to make the economy lower priced and more competitive. And that's what made industrial capitalism revolutionary. Getting rid of the landlord class was revolutionary. Getting rid of the monopolies was revolutionary. And even turning money away from usury and just pure exploitiveness into actually financing production was revolutionary. And all that seemed to be happening, especially in Germany, where you had a unity between government, the large banks, the Reichsbank, the military, and heavy industry. And that seemed to be the way to go. In England, financial policy would be to pay out profits as quick as you could to the financial owners. It was hit and run. But in Germany, the banks encouraged companies, don't pay out the profits to stockholders, reinvest it in your interest to grow so the economy can grow. We want to grow through equity, not through debt. Well, all of that changed in World War I. It's true that the monarchies were overthrown, but you also had a whole change in what socialism meant, and certainly the Russian Revolution, as it turned into Stalinism, transformed the whole idea of socialism, and they thought of socialism as being intrusive and essentially either Stalinism or Nazism, not as a byproduct of an evolution of industrial capitalism. And part of the problem was that the left wing, as it became Stalinoid, stopped talking about finance. Steve and I, if you look at who are the people that read and pay attention to what Steve and I are saying, it's sort of across the whole political spectrum. It's not left wing. If anything, it's more right wing. The right wingers are more focused on finance than the left wing. And so the idea of economic reform no longer had a political vehicle for it. Beginning with Ricardo, again in England, the critics of industrial capital said, well, we're not going to be able to get rid of the landlords until we democratize politics. We want to get rid of the House of Lords being able to dominate British policy, and we have to clean up the rotten boroughs. We have to democratize Parliament. And all of this came to an explosive head in 1909 to 10, when the House of Commons actually passed a land tax revenue bill, and the House of Lords vetoed it. And that was a crisis. And the result was that the House of Lords could never again block a revenue bill. So the capitalist sector was all in favor of democracy. But needless to say, the financial sector was all against democracy. The financial sector was, let's put it plainly, fascists. The financial sector did not want democracy unless it could manipulate the voters and confuse them into not understanding their class consciousness. And so you had a whole shift in how people thought about the economy, how they thought about what is capitalism and what is socialism. And the result is that the financial view of socialism is somehow high taxes on everybody and progressive taxation that would really hurt the poor more than the progressive people. All of that went by the wayside. Well, in 1913, the United States finished a whole fight with the Supreme Court. Are you allowed to actually tax wealth and tax income? Well, finally, the Supreme Court let there be an income tax. But only 1% of Americans had to pay an income tax. And this 1% were the rich, who made almost all their money through rents and finance, rent seekers. Well, all of that changed when there was a counter-revolution in economic theory saying progressive income's bad, you want a flat tax. Today, the richer you are, the lower your tax bracket. The lower income you have, the more you pay in taxes and various fees. So you've had a failure of the population to understand what Steve and I are talking about. That's why we're on your show, not on
CNBC.
Yeah.
But like it goes back further than that, and I think there's actually a extent to which it's actually a human characteristic as well. Because if you read like the very, very original neoclassicals, you have to read Augustin Cournot, who was a French mathematician around the turn of the 1800s, and Jean-Baptiste Say, who was a economist and libertarian in the 1820s. And they put across the idea of capitalism being a utility maximizing, welfare maximizing system. And it operated best when there was perfect competition, no monopolies in the sense of large companies. And they completely ignored the issue of land ownership and those are the issues we're talking about, the rent-seeking side. And what you got was with what became neoclassical economics was largely a reaction to Marx, because Marx took the classical school of economic thought and then turned that not as a criticism of feudalism and support of capitalism, but criticism of capitalism and support of socialism. Now, Marx's form of socialism was what we call democratic socialism today, education for the workers, healthcare, et cetera, but the vision that Say put forward was of capitalism, free market capitalism, as a utility maximizing system. And it gave you this vision of a world where there was no control and no power. So everything worked out fairly and everybody got what they deserved, a meritocracy. And humans, I think, have got and we see this in religions like Scientology and Catholicism and all the other religions around the world. We have a vision of a perfect society and we're very good at sharing that with each other. And capitalism, the neoclassical theory, puts across capitalism as a perfect system. And that is what lies behind the neoclassical zealotry, because they think they're going to make the world a better place if only they can get rid of the government intervention, get rid of trade unions, let the market decide, blah, blah, blah. And one of my favorite experiences of that ever was I set up a neoclassical economist. He didn't know he was being set up, but he was. I got him to talk to a bunch of unionists and management in the food industry back in Australia. This is back when I worked in part of the government called the Accord, which was supposed to get unions and management to get together to cooperate. Anyway, this guy came along. He was the person who worked out what's called the effective rate of protection. And there was a straightly neoclassical organization he worked for called the Industries Assistance Commission, the nickname of which amongst both the manufacturers and the workers was the Industries Assassination Commission. They were trying to abolish tariffs, abolish controls, et cetera, et cetera. This guy got blasted by both sides. He had no idea he was going to get shot, but he did. And I sat down with him afterward feeling sorry for him because he's, nobody else was talking to him. And he's sitting away and having a drink, and he finally says to me, and I quote, "Look, you're an economist. Help me convert these people. It's a religion, and they don't realize it's a religion. And anything which contradicts that religion, they don't look at, they walk away from. So one essential part of the religion is the idea that cost of supply rises because of what they call rising marginal cost. It costs more to produce each additional unit of output. And that's driven by what they call diminishing marginal productivity, which is that each additional worker is assumed to be as productive as the previous worker, but because you've got a crowded factory, effectively, they produce less output as more workers are added. So productivity per worker falls, cost per worker rises, rising supply curve. When they go and research that, they find that every last bloody firm they interview virtually says that doesn't apply to us. We've got constant or falling marginal costs. We design factories that are the most efficient at fullest capacity. And that's what so dozens of surveys have been done. Every last one has found at least 89%, and normally 95% of firms report constant or falling marginal cost. Now, what that means is the whole theory of welfare that's part of their model, it breaks down. So one of them made a big mistake, and a neoclassical economist called Owen Blinder made the mistake of doing a survey to ask manufacturers what their cost structures were. Got this answer, and literally, and I quote from his book, described as overwhelmingly bad news, brackets for economic theory. It was such bad news that his textbook doesn't even report his own research to his students. He continues with the myth. So this is what the behavior, it's not a behavior of a science, it's a behavior of a religion. And anything which doesn't fit the religion, you either don't look at it in the first place, or you reject it if you actually discover it. And that comes back to what is a religion? It's a way of saying, this is the way to the promised land. So they see capitalism as the route to the promised land. And that's why they fuck up the bloody thing, because it's got no relation whatsoever to the real world.
And so is it
Well,
reactionary?
it's a very heavily subsidized religion.
Oh, yeah,
you know.
yeah.
And most of the subsidies...
Which is why you and I are poor.
Yes, go to business schools. And the University of Chicago, founded by the Rockefellers to justify essentially his oil rent, is sort of the leader in the, it is quite frankly a fascist university. That was where the Pinochet fascism came from in Chile.
Yeah.
It was from the Chicago school. That's their doctrine is fascism. And
what they don't know it is. They believe their democracy.
They know what. No,
oh, no,
I went to the high. Let me tell you.
There. I mean, Red Milton. Okay.
Yeah, you weren't there. I went to the high school.
True.
When I was in high school in 10th grade, the social science teacher, Curtis Edgett, had a big sign over the bulletin board. I better not say it. That it was pretty. It was those of us who graduated from the high school and went on to college found when we got our FBI records that our professors normally turned in reports on us to the FBI about what we said in class all the time. I mean, it was, and the result is all this money going to the University of Chicago, Berkeley, and others. They have taken over the editorship of all of the main economic journals. So, and if you are a graduate in the United States, an economic graduate, whether you're hired or not by a university depends on how many articles you've had in the prestigious economic journals. And needless to say, you have to have the party line, or as Steve says, religion. I think a party line is better in order to get published there. So where I taught and modern monetary theory was taught at the University of Missouri at Kansas City, our graduates had great difficulty talking about money and debt, getting it published. They'd all get rejections. And as a result of having to publish only in the left-wing journals, they had great difficulty getting hired by prestigious universities. So it's a very well subsidized junk economics, basically.
And is the subsidy done in service of maintaining financial capitalism? Like, what is
amazingly enough, yes. Of course it is. They're going to they want to popularize something that says that they are productive, not unproductive. That's the great myth, that the parasites are productive. The parasites take over the body.
No, I'm talking from a broader experience of like not the mainstream university, like University of Chicago is absolutely top of the neoclassical pecking order. So I went to places like Sydney, New South Wales, Western Sydney, Kingston, and so on in the UK. And you still get people who've got are nowhere near this gravy train and nowhere near having political influence, are working for the state because they're often working in state-run universities, and they start this religion. They actually believe it. And that's why they're so fucking dangerous, pardon the French, because it's if you have somebody who's paid to believe it, so it's all they're helping out oil, blah, 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 you can pay them a bit more money, or that they've got to be at least partial, they've got to have some sort of, internal conflict out of the supporting libertarian arguments and knowing they're supporting multinational wealth and so on. But these people believe it, and they're not even getting rewarded for it. So that's why I'd say I see a religion as more appropriate analogy, because you have true believers who are in poverty because of what they believe. But they push out this myth of a libertarian, meritocratic system. And that myth persists partly because of money at the top, but also because many people believe it. And humans in general, I think, are seduced by the idea of a vision of a perfect society.
Well, I think Wall Street is not as bad as the universities. In Wall Street,
true.
they didn't care what my politics were. They knew what my politics were. All they cared was whether I was right or wrong. And I did very well on Wall Street. But in academia, they didn't care about whether I was right or wrong. All they cared about was what I believed. And they thought that certainly at the New School, which was a left-wing university under Bob Heilbronner, well, it was a Stalinist university, they thought that because I came from Wall Street, I had to be a left-winger. And Heilbronner said, look, if you're talking about finance, you're a right-winger. And I wanted to cancel debt. And he said that would just discredit the entire left. We can't talk about the need to cancel debt. And he also attacked me for writing for Catholic publications and for having the Catholic Church popularize my ideas as part of the land reform issues. So I found that the universities, especially the left-wing universities, were the most hardline, right-wing religious people. And Wall Street, they welcomed my ideas because Steve and I have the right ideas. That's why most of our support comes from the financial sector. They know what's happening.
It's ironic, but true.
Yes.
Yeah.
So if the financial sector
it's
supports,
a weird world.
Yeah, if the financial sector is
they don't support our
supporting,
policies; they support our analysis.
Yes.
I see. Okay, so what's
For internal use only.
Like, for example, I'm looking at my analysis now of credit and unemployment, and people that followed my work developed what they call the credit accelerator to explain the rise and fall of asset prices, and did very well out of speculating on the basis of that. I don't have the money to speculate, but I know people who've made a large amount of money out of following the idea that I have and Michael has and other people who are non-orthodox thinkers, because we're actually identifying what's going to cause the big change in the market next. Whereas the neoclassicals teach this nonsense of the efficient markets hypothesis. And you all know Warren Buffett, obviously. Buffett was being criticized when he was doing his degree and saying, look, there's no profit to be made. The market is efficient. And he said, if that's true, I'm going to be broke. Oh, he ain't broke.
So what is inside of the if the people on the inside of the financial sector realize that things are broken, what are the decisions that they are attempting to make in order to fix it? Or is the train...
Don't fix it.
Their idea of fixing it is to make as much money as they can. They want to fix it by increasing the stock prices on which their bonuses are fed. They want to fix it by using profits to pay out as dividends and for stock buybacks, not to invest. They want to fix it by making more money for themselves. That's their idea of acting rationally.
So we're trying to say, look, this is why the system fucks up. Let's do something to fix it. And they say, this is why the system fucks up. Let's ride the wave. So you do get some people in finance. I mean, Nick Haneur, for example, is somebody who's a socially minded billionaire, and he will be putting forward ideas about how we have to. His next book is on this topic, reforming the system. I don't know whether he'd go far as actually agreeing with wealth confiscation or even a modern debt jubilee. Maybe he would for the modern debt jubilee. But in general, people in finance are looking for an advantage. And if you're following a theory which is not delusional, then you're going to have an advantage. And Warren Buffett was the classic one of following a non-delusional theory. The efficient market hypothesis said you can't find a badly priced company.
Well,
And he said,
Steve,
you've got to be kidding. So that's how he made his money.
Well, Steve used the word reform, and the question is reform enough, or do you need a revolution? Reform is simply fixing an existing structure to make it stronger. A revolution is to change the structure, and we've reached a point at which, in order to save the economy, save the environment, save the world military situation, you need really a revolution. And I think Marx said the end of capitalism will not be a pretty sight on one occasion. And in a way, it's very funny. The people the debtors and the wage earners are not going to lead a revolution violently. Violence, ever since Greece and Rome, all the way to modern times, violence is always used by the free lunchers, by the rentiers, by the takers to protect their predatory power. It's not by the victims. Violence is by the victimizers, unfortunately. And so you need this forces a revolution, as you saw in Latin America. You had the revolutions have been sponsored by the United States, have all been from the right wing, from the pro-financial neo-feudal or outright fascist Pinochet Chicago sector. You had, and the one country that's immune mostly is China, that had its own revolution in order to make all of this possible.
Well, prior to the fascist revolution, there was something of a democratic revolution in Chile, from what I understand. Right? They had some sort of democratic election. This didn't go over well. The redistribution of land didn't go over well.
Right.
Particularly with the foreign investors.
And so Kissinger said, just because they vote wrong doesn't mean that we should follow them. You use the word democracy. Democracy is a euphemism for oligarchy. We're not in a democracy. We're in an oligarchy. And if you don't realize that, then you don't understand who's making the decisions of power and what governments are doing to protect oligarchic power against other people. And Aristotle, in his book on constitutions, said many constitutions claim to be democratic, but they're really oligarchic. And that's as much the case today as it was in his day.
Okay, so one of the problems that I see with debt cancellation is we had this very active debate about the canceling of student debts. Over the course of the last few years, definitely people are still talking about it. And on some level, I am viscerally pro the cancellation of student debt. On the other hand, what I see happening is you have the massive increase in the cost of education that's going to the administrations, and not towards professors and students. Like there was, I looked at this the other day, I think that Harvard has a 1-to-1 ratio almost of students to administrators. And so it feels like what you do in that case by canceling student debt is, yes, you relieve the individual, but you have passed an approving judgment on the structure of the universities that allows them to maintain this kind of but I mean, right? So okay, let me see if I can lay out the way that I think about this. So if you have a student that pays money to a university where most of the money is going to the administrators, and they've taken the money out as a loan, and they don't end up paying back the loan, but the loan is forgiven, the university has made a large profit. And there is nothing that prevents the university from continuing to extract wealth from the financial sector by getting these students to take these massive loans. The students get their loans eventually forgiven, but the system continuously ratchets up costs.
The system began by making students borrow money to do education. And this, I've experienced this from the very beginning to where I've literally caused a bit of a dispute in the Vice Chancellor's office when I decided to resign from Kingston University. This huge growth in administrators is all a product of turning universities into profit centres. Because when the universities were government funded, I'm talking in Australia's case now, government funded, they did have private fees initially. So if you didn't get in through competitive means, you could buy your way in. But most of the people got there through competitive means. And then in 70, I began university in 1971. In 73, we had a progressive Labor government come in, which abolished student fees. And that meant you went to university if you got a good enough mark. That was the only entrance you needed, was good school results. And at that point, the ratio of administrators to staff would have been 1 to 2 or 1 to 3. Three academic staff for every administrator, and the administrators were there to do the administrative work for the academics. So the hierarchy was definitely academics above, administrators below. When we got this push to commercialise universities again, your administrators became marketers. They end up on top. They're telling you what to do. And they had this enormous growth in a superstructure of what our great old friend David Graeber called bullshit jobs, whose whole role was to try to market the university. And then what they did, market the bloody vice-chancellor, who's just a damn clerk. And you see all the public relations for the university. It wasn't about the innovative academic stuff we had. It was what a great vice-chancellor we had. So this huge hierarchy of bullshit jobs to support the vice-chancellor developed out of commercialising it. And they're all competing. They start out, University of Western Sydney starts a department in Saskatchewan to try to compete for the Saskatchewan market, and they're all trying to get extra market share. It's ludicrous. And what it meant is far more of the money in university these days go to administration and marketing than actually goes to research and teaching. And I've lived through it. It's been a bloody nightmare. And that's why I was glad to leave the university sector in 2018. And I've done far more academic work since I left than I ever managed when I was there, because I've got rid of all the stupid form filling and ludicrous reports to bureaucrats who haven't got a fucking clue. Pardon me, I'm becoming really Australian talking about this. Haven't got a clue what an academic actually does, and got in the way of us doing the work that we all became academics to try to do in the first place. So the whole bureaucratisation and overloading of universities has been a product of commercialising them, believing the profit motive would work better for managing universities. In fact, it's corrupted them extremely badly, even to the point where I have had students say, look, I've paid for my degree. Like they've been shopping at Kmart and bought something, and they think they can walk out the door because they've paid the bill. Sorry, you're not bright enough. You deserve to fail. You can't tell you've got to pass the idiots these days. There's enough idiots already, But that's if you abolish student fees and abolish private funding, abolish you don't treat the student like a consumer. The student's a student. They're there to learn. Okay, and so they've got to compete well enough to get in. If they don't do well enough, they fail. I'm quite a libertarian in most of my attitude, but if you're not smart enough, if you don't get the exams done, you fail, you repeat. You can't do that to them these days. So if you got rid of the whole superstructure of turning them into marketed private institutions, you'd reduce the cost structure quite radically, and you'd make it cheaper to educate, and you'd have academics who've got time to be academics and think as well as teach well, rather than the shit we have these days.
Well, there's a race to the bottom going on also. How do you maximize your profit? You lower the cost of production. How do you, instead of hiring full-time teachers in the United States at let's say $60,000 a year, you can hire part-time teachers at $2,500 a year per course. And so you've had pushing them way down. There was a protest. I live in New York City, and I have friends who are professors at NYU, and they had professors who were complaining that no new professors were being hired. They were all part-timers, and you're having graduate students do the teaching, no hires, and there are more and more deans and sub-deans and bureaucrats, as Steve pointed out, being appointed. And what is the job of a dean? It's to lower the price of the people working for you, the lower the cost of teaching, and giving the income you save to yourself. So you make money by lowering the wages that are paid to the other people. So the professors have been downsized, basically, and a premium is put on inexperience, literally the race to the bottom. But that's not really the main cost. The main, what made China so great for thousands of years was Confucianism. The idea that everybody was going to take exams and you would have the best people basically ending up as administrators. If you limit university registration to the rich and say if you don't inherit your wealth, you're going to have to go into a lifetime of debt in order to get an education. And if you do not inherit enough money from your parents to pay, then you're not going to be able to buy a house. When you graduate, you're not going to be able to start a family because no bank will lend you money because your income over and above basic consumption goes to pay the university. Sorry, you can't afford a house. That's the result of not writing down student debt and of treating education not as a public utility, not as a human right, but as a profit center. That's the result.
And that's exactly what I'm pointing to. Which
you're saying you don't abolish the debt.
Yeah,
you think if you abolish the debt,
you don't run into the first place.
You abolish the debt, you get rid of the whole commercialization, you get rid of the administrative layer, and you drastically reduce the cost, and the state pays for education.
Yes,
but if you abolish the debt after this, because the students pay in the moment, the universities have already gotten that money, and so if you abolish the debt without a simultaneous shift in the way that the universities do business, then the universities are not suffering the ill effects of that debt abolishment because...
No, they've already got paid.
Yeah, exactly.
They've already got paid. This debt is owed to the government. It doesn't cost the government a penny to cancel the debt. It just is not going to collect the debt from the people, but it won't cost it a penny.
We're definitely in favour of completely changing the university system as well. It's a nightmare. When I did a PhD back in the 90s, late 80s, early 90s, and when I took it on, I suffered a substantial pay drop, but I didn't regard myself as putting myself in poverty for future. Now the pay that students in most universities, certainly American universities tend to be better actually on this front, better pay rates, but the pay rates are so bad that I've ended up telling my PhD students in later years, don't get a job at a university, learn how to make coffee, become a barista, work 9 to 5. If they force you to work later than 5 o'clock, I'll pay you time and a half. When you get home, you'll have plenty of energy to do the research you would have done if you had time as an academic. But instead, all the academics are working 2 and 3 positions. They're basically, it's Uber in front of a blackboard. Terrible situation, terribly insecure. It's an awful lifestyle. And that means what you're then saying, you're only an idiot would work at a university. And that ends up with a dumb population. And we want to go back to the stage of education, as Michael said, as a Confucian thing. It's the highest, it's the most exalted role. You get your best people in there and you give them time to think. And because we haven't done it, we're screwing up a capacity to think, and we're supposed to be an intelligent species.
Well, I think there's a vocabulary problem here. You're using the word university. What you really mean is a real estate company that holds classes in some of its real estate in order to get tax exemption on all of its other real estate. The largest real estate owners in New York are Columbia University and New York University. To them, giving an education is just part of the annoying overhead. They're into making real estate gains and increasing their endowment. That's so we really shouldn't think of them as teaching at all. They're real estate companies with a tax exemption.
But even so, Columbia and NYU, private universities, and so this real estate company model for them makes a lot of sense. But I'm thinking about even the University of California system, which is a public system. And, I was just looking at it. In the 1980s, I think tuition was $700 for a semester. Yeah. And now I think it's over $20,000.
Thank you, Ronald Reagan.
and that's all the cost increase by turning into privately run organizations.
Yeah.
Again, there's this myth we're talking about earlier. The neoclassicals believe everything is done better privately, lower cost, more efficient, blah, blah, blah. In fact, what happens is you have universities that used to be happy with their own intake, The University of Los Angeles wasn't trying to get students from San Diego. Then you put them into commercial. They're all competing for market share. So they start marketing, huge increase in marketing costs. They have all these bureaucrats who are now involved in packaging, sales material for the universities, and enormous distribution costs. So all that stuff doesn't exist when you don't have private competition. And you're far better off having publicly funded universities than private ones. A few private make sense in some areas, but to privatize the entire system ends up in a disaster. And that's what we've got now. And I've lived the experience of going from the days when it was state controlled and state funded, and you had to get good results to get in, and no money was paid. Now a fortune is paid, and the whole effort, everything is about getting more students in and marketing, and that dominates everything, including the teaching.
Well, let's talk about why there are public universities in America to begin with. They were created after the Civil War, as a result of the Republicans, protectionists, the industrialists coming to power. And I wrote a whole book about this, Americans' Protectionist Takeoff. The Republicans and the industrial capitalists who they represented had a problem. People who went to the prestige private universities, Harvard was considered to be the worst, but there were other bad ones, Yale and all of the Ivy League universities, basically all taught British free trade theory. Private universities in America, until the Civil War, were basically for training members of the clergy. And their economic course was taught in the fourth year, your senior year of college, and it was called moral philosophy. And this was all free trade. It was all British free trade theory. And the Republicans came in, and the business interests, and said, how are we going to get people educated in reality economics? The fact that free trade benefits the dominant country and prevents countries like us from catching up. Well, we're going to create state universities. And what we're going to do, we're going to give every state a land grant. And the land grant is going to enable them to fund courses for the public at large. And this is going to be where reality economics is taught instead of the British free trade right-wing theory. And that you had, in addition to the state universities, you had the first business schools that were funded. And the business schools were all staffed by Americans who'd studied in Germany and came back as social democrats or outright socialists. And the first economics professor in the United States at the first business school was Simon Patton at the Wharton School of Economics at the University of Pennsylvania, who developed the whole idea of public infrastructure as a fourth factor of production, but a factor of production that didn't seek profits or rents, but sought to lower the price for the economy as a whole. It was the business schools and the state colleges that taught, so essentially, how industrial capitalism would evolve into a mixed economy, quasi-socialist economy to benefit capital formation. And all of this, again, was changed in modern times. Somehow the universities have been financialized and taken over and become part of the race to the bottom. And as a result, you've had a stratification of the American economy. If you don't inherit wealth from your family, you have a lifetime of debt, and that is dividing the economy into two classes: the debtor class and the inheritance class. And is that really what you want the university system to produce? A class conflict?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's a huge problem. I see it in the smaller. We teach it. So we're living this. We're teaching at a university. So we teach at Southern Oregon University, which is about an hour away. And Shiloh's teaching astrophysics and cosmology. I'm teaching microbiology labs. And it's really interesting because there's some students that are first generation who are working full-time, going to school full-time, and they have this very, very clear vision for what their path is going to look like. Like, there's one girl in one of my classes, she's the oldest of four. She is her and her siblings are basically first generation born in the country. And she works full-time at a coffee shop and wants to be a plastic surgeon. And she has this arc laid out for herself, and she's very, very competent. And then there's other students who are clearly, they've been admitted to a for-profit system that doesn't really care if they succeed or they don't succeed, because they don't come to class, they don't do the work, and they're being charged for it. They've probably taken a loan to arrive there. And there's no mechanism by which the university takes it upon itself to say, hey, you need to stop paying us because this is extortionist and immoral, and just continues to collect from students that probably shouldn't be there. Like, they should take a couple years, figure it out, and come back. And it's really heartbreaking because it just seems like a place that is meant to be the source of foundational knowledge and wisdom for the society has been converted to yet another place of financialization, profits, and these interests that drive everybody into the ground.
And you're talking about that. Yeah, go on.
That is such a dangerous thing to do for what's the most important foundational thing of a civilized society is education.
But you're talking about education and something real. The fact is, if you and I were in a university, we couldn't fit what we're talking about into the curriculum. Right?
I had to make my own curriculum. Yeah. I mean, that's
lucky you.
I succeeded. I went up as I went down. So like I started off in the top university in Australia where I led a student revolt against economic teaching in 1973. I then used the second one where I got my PhD until they sacked all the tutors when there was a government decision in favour of employment permanency. They sacked all the tutors to get rid of having to give them permanency. And then I moved to a second-rate university called Western Sydney, where all the rebels ended up, mainly rebels. And so we had a progressive department there, and then Kingston. So I've been succeeding going up professorial scale while the university I've been teaching at have been going down. But all the top universities taken over by neoclassicals. They drop out.
That's actually one of the really wonderful benefits of teaching at a university that nobody knows anything about, is that there isn't a ton of oversight in terms of people telling me what I have to talk about in class. I actually sometimes sit back and I'm kind of like, wow, this is amazing that I can sit here and talk about some of these subjects I would never get away with, back in New York, like at Columbia, where we were at for grad school. It just couldn't, it would have been this very structured curriculum that fit into the wider political landscape and so forth. And so that's kind of a nice benefit, if you can afford to do teaching as a public service as opposed to a career, then it's quite nice for the professors.
It's a much better lifestyle. Yeah, that's true.
And you're talking about the core curriculum, and what I meant was, you can't fit what Steve and I are talking about into the core curriculum. Like at the new school, I wanted to teach about money and banking, and they really didn't want that. It was the left wingers. It was Heilbronner who didn't want money and banking. He said I was a critic of banking, not supporting it. And again, he didn't want me to talk about debt. So the core curriculum is even worse. Now, as I said, there's no history of economic thought in the core curriculum. There's no economic history in the curriculum.
There's no history in the sciences either, which is really disturbing.
Economic history.
Yeah, the lack of history. I feel like that's a huge problem in innovation too, is that people don't have time to go back and study in the sciences how people arrived at the various ideas that are popular. And how much debate really persisted throughout the last few centuries, right? A lot of the things people take for granted, the equations they learned, they were fought tooth and nail over. And there's still a lot of wiggle room that remains in some of those fundamental sciences, but no one would ever have the time to go back and check it out. And that's a bit tragic.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, it's worse than economics in that sense. I mean, I remember being at the University of New South Wales in 1987, 88, I think it was. And the economic historians were so sick of how they were being treated by the economics staff that because what would happen was they were forever having their courses chopped off and replaced by a course in econometrics, some particular application of econometrics. So they made an arrangement to move to the arts faculty. And there was, I remember the meeting quite vividly. They were pleading to be allowed to leave to go to the arts faculty. And the economics would not let them do that. They did not want a topic called economics in the arts faculty. They were offended by it. And of course, ultimately, they shut down the economic history unit. So I used to teach history of economic thought and Marxian economics, and they were both also shut down. So all the contemplative stuff disappeared. And the irony is now that neoclassical economists, and I'm thinking specifically people I know at Cambridge University, have no idea even of their own history, let alone the history of the institution they're at, let alone the history of the discipline. And that ignorance is where a huge amount of stupidity comes from in how economics develops further.
Well, the irony there is that it's the orthodox economics that should be in the arts faculty as part of the science fiction of the literature.
No, religion.
Okay.
I mean, I've got to get make. Did you enjoyed that paper I sent you a couple of days ago?
That was a great paper.
David Graeber. Okay, look, I'll give you this is an idea of what it's like. Give me a second. I'm going to find something in text and I'll read it out to you. Because in 2000, the change of the millennia, the most influential journal, the Quarterly Journal of Economics, that's ranked number 1 out of the University of Chicago, commissioned a number of economists to write a survey of where economics was and what's been the progress in the last century and what can happen again. And a guy is actually a nice bloke. I met him ultimately, called Ed Lazaire, who became the chief economic advisor to Bush. So he was chief economic advisor to the president during the financial crisis. Okay. And he wrote a paper called Economic Imperialism. And it wasn't a criticism. He's saying economics should be imperialistic because it's the only social science. Well, then, pride cometh before the fall, because the financial crisis occurred. And when I caught up with him in 2009, he said to me, and it was a private conversation, but he's dead now, so I can repeat it. He said, I don't know why they appointed me chief economic advisor. I'm a labor economist. I don't know anything about macroeconomics. So I'll find that quote, and this will give you an idea of the ideology in economics. Well,
while you're looking, if modern economics mainstream was correct, civilization never could have taken off. Imagine if there would have been a Milton Friedman or Chicago boy going back to Hammurabi, going back to the Bronze Age, and said, no, you can't you cannot cancel the debts because that's disturbs things. You have to let everybody collect the debts. You'd have the whole country living in poverty, as the biblical prophets described what would happen if you didn't have the Mosaic Jubilee year of debt cancellation.
And again, as Michael's the expert here, but a huge part of the struggles, because we read about the great men of history, the Caesars versus the Ptolemies and so on, it was all Caesar was, trust me if I'm wrong here, mate, but Caesar was in favor of reducing the debt.
Yes.
And he was knocked off by the the Praetorian class, whatever they're called. Against the darks. They didn't want to abolish the debt. So huge parts of the struggles throughout history have been debtors versus creditors. And societies work best when the debtors have won.
Well, they feared he was canceling the debts, and in fact, the only debts that he canceled were the debts owed by the rich people. The rich people, the financial sector is all for canceling the debts that it owes, but not the debts that are owed to it. And that was one of Caesar's failings. And if you look at there were a lot of Roman debt cancellations, canceling back taxes, and they were almost entirely, it was the large landowners and the large creditors that benefited, not the indebted population that had already lost its land through debt foreclosure.
So if with large... go ahead. No, go ahead.
Oh, can I read this thing? This will give you an idea of what economics is like. You guys were lucky not to do economics. This is the nature of economic thinking. This is Ed Lazaire, 2000, paper called Economic Imperialism. Economics has been successful because, above all, economics is a science. The discipline emphasizes rational behavior, maximization, trade-off and substitutions, and insists on models that result in equilibrium. Economists are pushed further to inquiry because they understand the concept of efficiency. Inefficient equilibria beg for explanation and suggest there may be gaps in the underlying models that created them, etc., etc. So I rewrote it at the end. And that's the first. There's actually 2 paragraphs like that. I say economics are being successful because, above all, economics is a cult. Its dominant sect emphasizes rational behavior, maximization, trade-offs, and substitution, and insists on models that result in equilibrium, thus insulating itself from the developments of 20th century sciences. Economists push farther into relevance because they're obsessed with the concept of efficiency. Inefficient equilibria beg for dynamics and evolutionary explanations and suggest there may be gaps in the brain wiring of economists who do not understand this. So this is the world we've lived in, and they think they're being scientific, and their definition of science should make a real scientist puke. Models that result in equilibrium? Huh? Which century are you from? But that's the mindset inside economics.
Yes, and the same in international trade theory. All of the trade theory, the Nobel Prize to Samuelson is that trade theory makes everybody, all the proportions equal between capital and labor, and it's just the opposite. If you have free trade, you polarize the economy, which is what the Americans realized when they decided to have a protectionist policy. That is what made them get so rich between the Civil War and World War I. So you're right. It's the economy is inherently polarizing and disequilibrium. But what's equilibrium? When an economics professor trips and falls on his face flat on the floor, that's equilibrium. When a society collapses, that's equilibrium. What does equilibrium mean?
Yeah. Well, what it means is they haven't been able to develop evolutionary thinking. Yes. And they suppress it because if you're in equilibrium, there's no point evolving any further. So this idea of equilibrium, which they think is scientific, has locked them off from all the developments from Lorenz on in complex systems and chaos theory and so on. And that's why you will not get progress. They've locked themselves into a dead end. Incredibly complicated, not complex mathematics is what they do.
Well, that's because if you talk about evolution, you're talking about the economy as a system with feedback. And all of the mainstream economics is what they call partial equilibrium. You can have just change one or two variables and the whole context remains unchanged. But any kind of evolution, any kind of a system, there's feedback that continually self-transforms the system. That's why Marx wrote at the very beginning of Capital, he wants to look at the laws of motion of capitalism. Well, economy says we don't want any motion. We don't want anything to change. We're in the ruling class right now, and we don't want to change it. We don't want to look at any law of motion that's going to reform and revolutionize society and take away what we've grabbed.
I wonder about. Go ahead.
Well, I wanted to pivot a little bit. So I'm hearing revolution from Michael and collapse from Steve, and I want to be able to imagine what comes after that. Are these changes things that can be implemented at the constitutional level if there is a new state, say, that appears? What sort of reconstruction ideas could go into a better state in the future?
Like after the Mad Max period?
Yeah, after the Mad Max period.
So, we have Mad Max. What happens? Somebody rises from the ashes and is like, let's write a new document.
Well, let's assume that the neo-feudalistic financial capitalism is a dead end and it inevitably fails in whatever way that it does. What should we expect, as the penners of a new constitution? Is this something that can be fixed at the outset?
Well, that's what you're having in the whole international economy. That's what the BRICS Plus is all about. The world is polarizing between the garden and the jungle. You have the whole Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the whole China, Russia, the whole global majority is realizing that what they call de-dollarization isn't simply not using the dollar, it's creating a new kind of an alternative to the International Monetary Fund, an alternative to the World Bank, an entirely new system of international relations. Multipolarity is what they're talking about. So you're seeing that. You're not seeing that in the revolution is not occurring in the West. You have the counter-revolution here. The revolution is now in Eurasia. That's where the revolution is, and you're going to see the China-type mixed economies are going to take off because that's where the industrialization is, the trade, the research, the rising living standards. You're going to have the Eurasia and the global South unifying into exactly where industrial capitalism seemed to be going in the 19th century, and you'll have the United States and Europe in the post-industrial society, meaning a lapse back into neo-feudalism. Until finally, presumably, the garden is going to decide to let the jungle in and to have the mixed economy that the classical economics had expected all along, but which you're only finding in Eurasia now. And they call it socialism.
That's the optimistic view. Sorry. So because I'm working in climate change and I'm reading what the climate scientists are talking about and reading what economists are bullshitting about, I expect a total breakdown of society. Okay? And it'll be a question of which societies survive through that whole process. It's not going to be like a global collapse, just like climate change is not going to be an instantaneous thing everywhere. It's going to be something where some societies can cope and others don't, depending on the changes we face. We're already seeing, absolutely crazy weather in the last 3 years, getting more crazy every year. You know that October last month rather, was 1.8 degrees above the pre-industrial average. We're talking about saying below 1.5. We've had 3 months in a row where we're above 1.5, quite substantially. And so, according to economists, that'll have a trivial impact upon the economy. But also, according to economists, and there's a survey by two, I don't know the hack, I think they might be commercial researchers, Howard and Sylvan, Sylvan, did a survey in 2021, getting the consensus of economists on climate change. And they predicted that 7 degrees of warming in 2 centuries' time, a trajectory towards that, so 7 degrees by 2220, would reduce global GDP by 20% compared to what it would have been in the absence of global warming. And that would mean that rather than being 21 times the size of today's economy, it'll only be 17 times the growth. So the actual impact on the rate of economic growth was a reduction in the annual rate of economic growth of 0.02%, which is 1/5 of the accuracy with which economists can currently measure real change in GDP over time. So in other words, trivial. You read the science papers, and there's a paper saying in 2021, I'll find it if necessary on my computer, what level of temperature increase over the pre-existing level caused the previous 6 mass extinctions? And the answer is 5.2 degrees. So a 5.2 degree increase in temperature over the previous level triggers the last 6 major mass extinctions, where 85% or more of species went extinct. Okay. So economists think you can go 2 degrees higher than that and have a small reduction in the rate of economic growth. That's how ignorant they are. But the trouble is, politicians don't know just how ridiculous their work is. They think this is based on scientific research. They don't read the scientists, they read the economists instead. And so we're blindly walking into this catastrophe. That's why we've done nothing about global warming. So what I expect is, and you also got politicians in charge who are narcissists. They're not chosen for their skills or their decision-making prowess. They're idiots. Okay, so they're going to make the wrong decisions anyway in response to all this. So I just see a period of massive chaos. Maybe a couple of societies will have a chance of surviving. China is one, though China has a problem in that it doesn't produce all its own food, which is a major issue. Because if you can't feed your population, you can't hold it together. So there's a minority of countries which are food self-sufficient right now, major exporters, including America as it happens, but I can't see America holding together. So the small ones that don't have America's weapons problem might have a chance of survival. And then it's a question of what do we do to respond? Will there be massive geoengineering attempts, given what productive capacity we have in that situation? I think there will be. I think you'll see chaos in temperature levels if you actually get successful geoengineering. So I see a horrific, if we're lucky, 50 years, if we're unlucky, 500. Then out of that, you might get a civilization that develops. But my fear there is we're going to get a civilization that is anti-technology. And you'd end up with a religious, and seeing technology as the cause of the chaos we're about to go through, when in my opinion, and from my reading of the literature, the blame lies with the economists who encouraged us to continue growing, when the engineers wrote the limits to growth, not hippies. Engineers 50 years ago were saying we have to taper. We have to reduce our rate of growth. We have to stabilize population, have to stabilize our energy load. If we'd followed the engineers, we wouldn't be in the situation we're in. But the engineers will most likely get the blame. And you're likely to get an technological society coming out of that. So I think we're going to be back wearing, men wearing dresses, telling us what to do, and maybe they might have a if they're lucky, they might have 500 million people listening to them, because the other 7.5 billion aren't going to make it.
Well, what's
Well, the
interesting is that-
economists are really just hired guns to promote this. I was working at the Hudson Institute in the 1970s, and one of the programs we had was a national security study of global warming that was run by the CIA. The CIA expected everything that you've talked about, Steve, and they said, and this is America's interest, because we're a food surplus country, and this global warming will wreck the rest of the world and increase our power. We're all for it. We're going to put all of our strength behind the oil industry, and one of the byproducts of that was ERDA, the Energy Research Development Organization, said we've got to develop the tar sands in Canada. That's the most polluting source of energy in the world. We've got to speed up global warming to speed up America's domination. This is what the CIA was believing and telling and hiring economists to produce. They didn't circulate my study or the internal studies for national security, but they hired your economists to be the public relations people for all of this. So they knew it, and it was the United States that is pushing the idea of global warming, thinking it will benefit because of its control of the oil industry.
Yeah, I mean, I'm saying that as being part of it, but economists played their own role. Nordhaus destroyed the limits to growth.
They play their role
without
yes.
understanding. Okay.
Yes,
but and you did have some people in the oil industry who were saying this is going to be catastrophic over the long term.
Yes.
So but in terms of the capacity of Americans to shoot themselves in the foot, I'm never going to argue against it.
Okay.
There's been an interesting push for special economic zones where people are seeing that this is starting to collapse, and I think that they're looking to history and they're saying, okay, well, one of the greatest vessels for change is the ability to go to a place where rules have not been set up yet, where things are not yet calcified into the old systems, and to begin again. And so I know people that are part of various projects. Oftentimes they're libertarian projects. I know that Peter Thiel is in the background talking about, like sea civilizations. And that to me feels like, on one hand, I think it's destined to fail. But on the other hand, I also look at it as being the only possible way to start to seed something that can run and grow in parallel to the systems that we have. Because if you're right, and if it does just shake itself apart, that's the worst possible outcome. Like I always use the same example. If you build a new bridge, like there was the Bay Bridge in San Francisco needed to be rebuilt. They didn't wait for the bridge to fall and then build a different bridge. They built the new span directly next to it, and when the span was built and tested, they redirected traffic to it and took apart the old one. And so are special economic zones a possible way to rebuild the span while the other one is busy collapsing, or is that just a pipe dream?
No.
Pipe dream, because you need a climate that supports a sedentary civilization, and we're generating one that doesn't support a sedentary civilization. Like London at the moment, it didn't have as much damage that they thought it would cause, but the storm Ciarán was actually a Category 3 cyclone, went through London. Now, they're lucky about the way that the storm damage was distributed. London didn't get totally destroyed or anything like it. It's fairly minor, apparently, in London. Pretty damn dramatic on the coast of Brittany. But if the storm comes through like that, if you happen to be in the region where you're trying to build your bridge, and then you get a cyclone like that, or a period of high temperature that destroys the grain, or hailstones that destroy your greenhouse, et cetera, you're going to have to persuade on an incredible industrial scale to be in any sense immune to that. And you're going to need people, you're going to need skilled people who are going to be willing to work for you when the fact that you have money is no longer relevant. So that, to me, you'd only do it if you have a real egalitarian survivalist society. And what I've been seeing so far isn't egalitarian.
Also
Well,
an
most of the great
ideologically
fortunes
motivated
have been
one.
made in economic collapse. It's a lot quicker to make a fortune in economic collapse than in a non-economic collapse. And you can, I can guarantee you, there are a lot of financial speculators looking at what Steve's writing and saying, "Okay, there's going to be a crisis, environmental crisis. How can we make money off this?"
They're not going to happen. It's too crazy, too crazy.
I wonder if you have been exposed at all to what's called the doomer optimist community.
No, I know quite a few communities in the area, so tell me about doomer optimists.
Doomer optimists are basically people that I would bet agree with you largely on the course of human events and the way that the industrial system is going to collapse. And in the shadow of the collapsing megalodon, they're basically scavenging parts of it in order to be able to build family and community-based systems that are going to be able to weather the collapse and be sufficiently robust to operate in the absence of money, like you say, because you're exactly right. If money disappears, the thing that you need is an ideological commitment to the system that you're building. And it seems like this is the time for the emergence of these kinds of groups, because lots of people are realizing that capitalism can't keep going the way that it's going. I think everybody's very pessimistic about reform. And so the only possible alternative is to build these systems. And a lot of them are farm-based. A lot of them are buying up properties in, Ecuador and Costa Rica and in places where they're going to be largely protected against giant temperature increases. Because from everything that we've learned in talking to climate scientists, the greatest temperature increases are going to happen away from the equator. So the equator is going to stay about the same. And so if you move to the tropics, then the impacts will be significantly less. And a lot of these people are moving to Central America. There's also the massive changes in climate zones that might happen. Like 5,000 years ago, the Sahara was a green paradise. And so if you have climate change and Europe becomes inhospitable, covered with an ice sheet, it might be that Northern Africa suddenly becomes the paradise in the garden. And so you do have to see a massive shift of people, but it's not that the species goes extinct. And the people who will flourish in that condition, by necessity, will have to be the ones that embrace technology, right? Because how could you not embrace technology and survive that?
What the problem you have is scale. So, I agree that is more likely to be a survivable system, but it has to be what Nate Hagens, I'm presuming you know Nate Hagens, Nate calls the great simplification. Because you're not going to have computer chips, in that world. You may have to go back to, resistor and, valve-based computers, something you can manufacture on a small scale, because the extent to which we have, the scale of manufacturing is beyond most people's comprehension today. The one company that makes the machines that make the chips, advanced chips, which is a Dutch company, I think costs $450 million per machine. And there's only one company making it. They won't have a market to make those machines if you're down to a population of, scattered populations of between 500,000 and 50 million surviving in largely around the equator. Ironically, I think you're quite right about that. So they're going to have to be technological, but it's going to have to be a bit like, if you know the old movie MacGyver, it's survival technology. It's not high-scale industrial technology. I hope something like that happens, because the thing that I fear most about what we're going through is the loss of knowledge. As much as we've criticised, capitalism in this conversation and the amount we know about the universe, and you guys are in a better position to be aware of that than we are. The amount we know about the universe is amazing. And I think we might lose all that and go back to a primitive level of knowledge, and actually an anti-technology world. I think it'd be a greater tragedy than the loss of people we're going to face, frankly. So I want to find ways to keep that technological dream alive. And as you say, you're going to have to be technological to survive in that world anyway. But it'll be low-scale technology, not high-scale.
From everyone that I've talked to, I think that the answer is to start carving things into stone.
As to what?
Is to start carving instructions into stone. because stone will survive the cataclysm, even if
I
they
mean, I've
find
got
it off the ground.
one of my colleagues who I've never got around to writing a third edition of Debunking Economics, but he wants to publish that on parchment so that it will not decay. Okay? And like, I think that's a great idea. I had to change my direction from writing a third edition of Debunking Economics to attacking the idiot economists who've done the work on climate change, because again, it's raising a warning before a crisis, which is what I did before the financial crisis in 2008. I'd abandoned everything to write blog posts about the coming financial crisis. This is the coming ecological crisis, and the trouble is, you could even bad economic management could reverse the damage. It could minimize the damage of a financial crisis, but there's nothing that can minimize the damage we're going to do to the productive capacity of human civilization by the degree of climate change we're generating right now. And by the time we realize that, it's going to be too late to do something on a global scale. So it comes down to local initiatives. Some countries may be able to do it. The small, pretty authoritarian countries like Thailand is a possibility, cohesive. Maybe China, parts of China, though I worry about the food production issues there. But yeah, your little communities may be a bit like the monasteries of the Dark Ages, keeping knowledge alive while the rest turns into a primitive world.
Mm.
Baked
Yeah, I don't think I
tiles in
quite.
a pyramid are how to keep your books going. Baked ceramic tiles on a wall in a pyramid.
I'll give it a try.
So I didn't quite get an answer to my question about what a new state that was more effective and had safeguards against these kind of corruptions would look like. Is that something that can actually be established at the constitutional level?
Well, if you realize that economies tend towards a financial polarization and a debt crisis, then you need a regular debt cancellation. You had that for thousands of years in the ancient Near East. That's why I wrote and forgive them their debts. So yes, it's been done before. But if you realize that the tendency of economies is to polarize, not for disequilibrium, not equilibrium, then you have policies that are going to deal with this inevitability of polarization and disequilibrium. So you need a different mathematical basis of economics than you have today. And if you have the right diagnosis, then you have the remedy that's indicated by it.
I think you also have to have humanity has to respect life, and we haven't, and we're destroying life. My overall perspective is that we have to see our role as being custodians of life, and that means reserving a large part of the planet for non-humans. E.O. Wilson was talking about the 50% rule, that half the planet humans should be excluded from half the planet. I actually think that's excessive. I think it should be 80% of the planet should be excluded from humans, and we do what we can in the 20%. But we know this is the only planet we know of in the in the universe that supports life. And with what we know now in terms of what are the possibility for habitable worlds elsewhere, it's extremely rare. It may be so rare that we could be the only one. We might be another one which goes through this whole process of a takeoff driven by fossil fuels, global warming, and collapse again. Maybe this is the great filter we face in the future. But if we're going to survive, we have to be aware that life is fragile, and we have to see ourselves, if we are the intelligent species, we have to prevent its breakdown. The long-term thing, as you both know, is the sun will become a red giant, and in its evolution towards that, in about less than 1 billion years, the energy we get from the sun will destroy the oxygen levels on the planet.
I mean, I see that in some sense as the main project of space exploration, whether people realize it or not. Why are we interested in the moon? Because it'll make a great industrial outpost for establishing longer range space flight. And even our search for life, it's like really motivated by a search for habitable regions of the cosmos that we can explore and potentially set up a backup hard drive for ourselves here.
And I think we have to do that. I agree. And that's like, I'm a Musk fan on that front, because if he started SpaceX, and whether or not the only way it could survive on Mars is by having a highly technological society and an egalitarian one as well. So whether we get there, I think, I don't think the timing is good. I think we're going to fail on that one. But you have to ultimately see our role as being able to maintain life, an intelligent life. And that's what that should be first and foremost what humans do. Everything else should be secondary. It should just be driven by that objective. And the trouble is that we are so caught up in our own squabbles and our own attempt to see everything as if there's nothing other than our species on the planet, that we're ending up destroying our capacity to survive on this planet ourselves.
I feel like it's very hard for the average person to care about these large issues of species diversification and so forth when they feel like they have a boot on their neck. Like they feel like they don't have control over their governments. They feel like they don't have control over the financial institutions. They need to invest in these financial institutions in order to fight inflation to begin with. And so there's just like a real powerlessness. I mean, the best thing you can do to clean up the planet is to make poor people not poor, right? We know that people who are not completely under the thumb of privation, like they're able to actually take care. That's something they start to care about all of a sudden. And so in some sense, it seems like the path to a more sustainable ecology is by making people less poor.
Yeah, having an egalitarian. I mean, for example, there's an Italian guy who's in charge of attempting to design what would be the colonies on Mars. And I saw him being interviewed about this. It's a YouTube channel, obviously. And he was asked about the social structure. He said it has to be egalitarian. You can't have somebody on Mars having 10 or 100 times the space that the average person does. Engineering alone rules it out. And you want to have a society which regards every person as contributing together. It has to be egalitarian. It has to be shared. And in the long run, that's, if we're going to have a potential survival as a species, we have to extend that to all of life. And we're nowhere near thinking in that way as a species at the moment. And what worries me is that we won't get there anyway, that you'll end up with the religious nutcases taking over again in the aftermath to an industrial collapse caused by climate change, which they'll blame on technology, rather than seeing technology as the potential solution to avoid that world.
Well, interestingly enough, as Michael's shown in his writing, that the more sustainable economies of, say, the Sumerians were headed by religious nut jobs. That's quite interesting because they in some sense had a responsibility to some cosmic significance that was beyond the scope of individual sequestering of wealth. And so I wonder if there isn't something useful about that way of looking at the world.
Well, all those low surplus economies were, if not egalitarian, they had checks on egotism. They had checks against the accumulation of wealth. If somebody could get, you'd let people get wealthy, but you'd have to bury the wealth with them. It wouldn't be transmitted to the family to become a hereditary wealth. And when there'd be funerals, and you'd have wealthy people buried with all of their jewelry. But then when the funeral is over, you'd distribute the jewelry all through the people. There are many, the anthropology shows that all of these societies had checks on this and balances. Of course, some people, you're going to have egotism, you're going to have people wanting to get rich, but you're also going to have society protecting itself against this. And if you're rich, you have a big feast. And you provide food for everybody, and you get status by being generous, not by being selfish. Not where University of Chicago graduates would do well.
Well, I feel like we have covered a lot of ground. We've done three hours here, and one thing I wanted to ask you guys before you left was who we should be talking to expand our perspectives on these issues. Who are people that you think are really worth talking to in order to make this an even bigger conversation?
I think you should talk to Steve Keen.
I was afraid you'd say that.
Michael Hudson.
We definitely will more. For sure.
I mean, it's a dilemma, because there are certainly people like E.O. Wilson, who's unfortunately died. People like I think Jürgen Randers, who was one of the two surviving members of the Limits to Growth study. Dennis Meadows, who's still alive and kicking. People working in system dynamics. Mike Radzicki would be embarrassed if I mentioned him here, but he's the leading person in developing the capacity to think in a systemic way. And that's our failure to think about the overall system. So there are a range of people out there, but I've lost touch in a lot of ways because I've been forced to fight neoclassical economists so much. I've destroyed my own brain capacity in taking on those bloody idiots. And because you're fighting myths all the time, I'm not trying to track down people who are providing new ways of thinking. So I'm unfortunately, because I have to fight that battle, I've lost touch with the people who are the inspirational thinkers about the future.
Michael, are you in the same boat?
Yes, I can't think of. There's no. You really need a new science, not economics, but something that does talk about the whole world as a system. And if you talk about the world as a system, you'll realize just what Steve's talking about with this global warming. This is how economics began in the United States. Already in the 1840s, you were talking about this, and the environmental overhead and how that had to be included in the national statistics. And the free traders all opposed this. So there's always been this opposition between reality people who looked at the system and people who said, don't look at the system, let's have a cover story. And there are not many people doing what Steve and I are talking about today because they're not a discipline. What do we call ourselves? Do we call it? I call myself an archaeologist. I used to call myself a futurist when I worked with Herman Kahn and Alvin Toffler and these people. But maybe you should call us futurists, but not economists. What do we call it? I don't know.
We have Kate Rayworth coming in a couple of weeks.
Good.
Good.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's going to be interesting. We're also trying to get Nate Hagens, but he...
I met with him last week.
We don't
have a podcast on the books yet, so...
So if you see him, put in a good word for us.
Yeah, we'll do. Nate and I are in touch fairly regularly.
Excellent.
So I'll do that. Okay.
Yeah, thank you, gentlemen. This has been illuminating, and I feel like I get smarter every time I talk to either one of you, so I've learned so much, and...
I feel like I get smarter when I talk to both of you at the same time.
Yeah. Exponentially.
And I still haven't done any promoting for the function in Austin. I've got to do that. I've just been overwhelmed. So I've got your things to help promote it, but kick me in the backside occasionally to get me to do something because I've just got too much work on.
Definitely. We will we're actually taking a little break for a week, and so we'll have some more bandwidth to think about that, and so we'll send you some notes.
Beauty. Okay, thanks again for the conversation. Good to see you, Michael. Say hi to Grace.
Thank you both so much for coming.
Thank you. All right, bye everybody.
Bye, all.